The next 3 hours is your chance to participate in a discussion with one of today's leading inventors. Join us as Book TV's In Depth welcomes Ray Kurzweil, author of the best-selling book The Age of Spiritual Machines. His latest is The Singularity is Near, When Humans Transcend Biology.
First of all, would you tell the folks your name and the size of the curtain that's moving in? Oh, I'm sorry. Your name, please.
My name is Raymond Kurzweil, and I'm from Queens, New York.
Queens, New York. Well, panel, Raymond and I just happened to have brought along this little piano here, as you see. And Raymond, in addition, also happens to have, as the old saying goes, happens to have a piece of music with him. And before we show the audience what his secret is, we have just a few seconds for Raymond to play this piece of music. Raymond, the piano's all yours.
Thank you.
Nicely played, and now your performance, of course, leads into your secret, so if you'll whisper it to me, we'll let everybody at home know what's up. Well, that certainly deserves applause, but, oh, the subway's leaving. That deserves applause, but what has it got to do with the music? I don't understand that. Ah, I see. Raymond's secret concerns something that he did, and we'll start the game this time with Bess Myerson.
Raymond, that's a very unlikely sounding piece of music. Am I being supercritical?
No.
Did you compose it?
No, I didn't.
Oh. Did you, however, were there some kind of formulas or letters or something unusual used to compose, to make up the notes of this piece?
You could say that, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for example, would the notes spell out a name, or would they be a mathematical formula, or anything like that?
Not spell out a name, nothing like that, no.
But there are very...
$20 down, 60 to go. Henry?
Was that thing written by a computer?
Yeah.
Wow, yeah. Is it writing music at this moment?
Right now it's writing a tune.
Writing a tune. I have a feeling that as a non-scientist, I'm not going to understand this too well, but perhaps you can explain how it works. First of all, I want the folks to see sort of some of this. This nest of spaghetti-like wire here is united to a bunch of little watts. What are these black things over here, Raymond?
Well, those are relays, and that's what does the trick. That's what writes the music.
I see. The relays write the music. They feed it into this white cheese box here, whatever that is, and there are three little... Are these wires or just pieces of string?
Pieces of string or wires.
I mean, does a message go through there, or do they just pull the thing?
No, that's just recording what the computer says.
I see. And then the typewriter does the final part of the process.
Ray Kurzweil, what were you thinking as you were watching that?
I haven't seen that for a while. I looked pretty relaxed there at age 17. So.
What made you want to create a computer that could write music?
That was actually my first pattern recognition project. I mean, that's been my field of interest. I've been fascinated with how the human brain is able to recognize patterns, and we actually realize now that that is the heart of human intelligence. I mean, that is what humans are good at. That's where we still excel in comparison to machines, and that we can recognize patterns, only certain type of patterns. But machines are getting better, and I've been studying that field and trying to teach computers to recognize patterns. And that, I think, is really the heart of human intelligence. When we figure that out, we'll be able to create machines that have the full range of human intelligence.
And why is it important to have machines do that?
Because it's an expansion of our own intelligence. I mean, we already expand our own intelligence with our machines. And we routinely do intellectual feats that would be impossible without our computers, whether it's math or science. In fact, few professionals could do their jobs today without our machines. We have an exponentially expanding knowledge base. We're the only species that has knowledge, and that doubles in size every year. And we need our technology to keep track of it. And we need pattern recognition to actually find the information that we want to find. And so this is really part of the manifest destiny, if you will, of our civilization, to expand knowledge. And pattern recognition is really the key to both creating knowledge and finding it and applying it.
And could you boil that down to a practical application? If a computer does and is able to do that, what could computers do with that kind of information and knowledge?
Well, one thing that I've found exciting, what's exciting for an inventor is not just an abstract theory, but that sort of leap from formulas on a blackboard to actually changing people's lives. And for people that have sensory disabilities, for example, blindness, and I've worked in that field for 30 years, we can use pattern recognition to overcome those problems. So actually the first major project I worked on was a print-to-speech reading machine for the blind. Worked with the National Federation of the Blind on that, the nation's leading organization of blind people, and created a machine that could read printed books out loud to people by recognizing the print in any type style. Character recognition at that time was not really intelligent. It would just match pixel for pixel. It was called template matching. And so print had to be in one type style, and it had to be perfectly printed. So it couldn't read ordinary books and magazines and newspapers. So my team and I created the first omni-font, any type font, character recognition, and we created a print-to-speech reading machine for the blind. And I've stayed involved with that field for 30 years. We just introduced a pocket-sized reading machine, the Kurzweil National Federation of the Blind Readers. So a blind person can stick it out of their pocket and read print as they go through the day. Sign on a wall, back of a cereal box, ATM display, menu in a restaurant, handout at a meeting, and really overcomes the principal handicap associated with visual impairment.
What are today's computers able to do as far as your ideas for how they can accommodate that technology, and what do the future of computers hold as far as what they'll be able to do?
Well, a lot of people ask whatever happened to artificial intelligence, and kind of reminds me, people go in the rainforest and say, where are all the species that are supposed to be here? When there's 50 species of ants within 10 yards of them. AI, artificial intelligence, machines doing tasks that used to require human intelligence, is deeply integrated into our infrastructure. I mean, every time you send an email or connect a cell phone call, or you buy a product that was designed with computer-designed software that's intelligent, just-in-time inventory levels are controlled by intelligent algorithms, manufactured in robotic factories, intelligent algorithms fly and land airplanes, guide intelligent weapon systems, make billions of dollars of financial decisions, and I could give you a long list. So we are, our whole economic infrastructure is amplified. We are far more productive, and in fact, far wealthier because of this type of intelligent technology. And these were actually research projects 15 years ago. And the thrust of my books is that we will actually achieve the full range of human intelligence, both because computers are growing exponentially in capability. They're doubling every year for the same price. That's multiplying by 1 billion in 30 years. It's actually 25 years to be exact. And if you imagine how influential they are already, imagine multiplying their capability by 1 billion in the next quarter century, you get some idea of what will be feasible. And the software is also improving. One of the sources of that is to actually figure out how the human brain works. And we're making exponential progress in that. The spatial resolution of brain scanning is doubling every year. The amount of data we're collecting on the brain is doubling every year. The latest generation of brain scanners can actually see now for the first time individual interneural connections. We can see our brain create our thoughts. We can actually see our thoughts create our brain because we actually create new brain matter as we think about things. And we're also showing that we can turn this information into working models and simulations of brain regions. There's already 20 regions of the brain out of several hundred that exist that we have actually modeled and simulated in computers, and then we can apply sophisticated tests of the simulation and get similar results as applying those same tests to human capability. Includes the cerebellum, where we do our skill formation. It's an important region, comprises more than half the neurons in the brain. And I make the case in my latest book, Singularity is Near. In fact, chapter 4 is devoted to this. So within 20 years, we will actually have models and simulations of all several hundred regions of the brain, including the cerebral cortex, where we do our abstract reasoning, and there's already a simulation of that being developed by IBM. And we will have then the tool, we'll have the secrets of human intelligence. We'll have more insight into ourselves, And the toolkit that we use in artificial intelligence to create intelligent machines will be greatly expanded to incorporate the methods that our own brains use. And then machines will operate at human levels, but it won't be an alien invasion of intelligent machines to compete with us. I mean, it really is amplifying our own civilization, and we're going to literally enhance our own intellectual capabilities by ultimately merging with this technology.
And that's what you mean by the term singularity?
Well, this leads up to the singularity. I mean, we can talk more about how we get there, but a really key threshold is achieving human levels of intelligence, the full range, particularly our powers of pattern recognition, which, as I said, is the core of human intelligence, in a machine. And I've been consistent for decades now that 2029 we will achieve that threshold. But that won't automatically profoundly transform human civilization. We already have human intelligence. We've got billions of people walking around with human intelligence. But the biological intelligence of our civilization is fixed. We have 10 to the 26th power calculations per second in all of the 7 billion humans on this planet. That's not going to grow. 50 years from now, it'll still be 10 to the 26th power. Non-biological intelligence is multiplying by 1,000 every decade, and even that speed is speeding up. So non-biological intelligence will ultimately exceed biological intelligence. We will merge with this technology, and I can describe how that will happen. But if you go out to the 2040s, the non-biological portion of the intelligence of our civilization will be about 1 billion times greater than the biological portion. Now that's a profound transformation. And we use the metaphor borrowed from physics of a singularity, really referring to the event horizon. In physics, there's an event horizon around a singularity, around a black hole. It's very hard to see past it because the gravity inside the event horizon keeps all the information in. There's some quantum ways that you can get the information out, but basically it's hard to see past the event horizon. But we can use our intellect to talk about what life would be like past the event horizon. So borrowing that metaphor to human history, there will be this profound transformation where we're going to amplify our own intelligence 1 billion-fold by the middle of this century. And it's hard to see past that event horizon because it's so transformative. On the other hand, we can use our intellect, such as it is, to talk about what life will be like in 2045, 2050, and that's what I try to do in my book. It basically refers to a profound transformation as we multiply our own intelligence through this exponentially growing, non-biological intelligence that we're creating.
Why not leave human intelligence as it is and let it progress as it should on its own?
Well, there's a few reasons. I mean, I'll mention two. I mean, one is we have a lot of suffering in the world that we want to overcome. And technology's already greatly amplified our ability to solve problems. Human life expectancy was 25 post-infant mortality 1,000 years ago. It was 37 in 1800. I mean, Schubert and Mozart died in the 30s. That was pretty tragic, but that was typical. There was no sanitation, no antibiotics. Life was short, brutish, disaster-prone, disease-filled, poverty-filled. I mean, Thomas Hobbes describes it quite well. And we've come a long way because of technology, and we're now going to be reprogramming the information processes underlying biology. Biology basically is a set of information processes, but we didn't have the genome until 3 years ago. But we're now actually gaining the means to reprogram our biology. We can turn genes off with RNA interference. The discoverers of that just got the Nobel Prize a couple of weeks ago. We can add new genes with gene therapy. We can turn on and off enzymes. We can reprogram biology. And we can go beyond biology by merging it with nanotechnology. That's something that will be feasible in 20 years. But if you look at where we've come, this is not a new story. We are the species that goes beyond our limitations. We didn't stay in the ground, we didn't stay in the planet, and we haven't stayed with the limitations of our biology. Human life was very, very hard. I mean, it was extremely high levels of struggle. Just 100 years ago, human life expectancy was 45 in 1900. When Social Security was put in place in the 30s, 65 was considered quite old. I mean, I'm pushing 60, and I don't consider, I mean, I can collect Social Security in a few years. I don't really, I mean, I feel that the nature of aging has changed. But there's still a lot of suffering. I mean, you don't have to look far to find people who let's say, got a diagnosis of cancer or are struggling with some other disease or profound problem of one kind or another, poverty. We're making progress because of technology. The World Bank reported that poverty in Asia, it's been cut by half over the last decade because of information technology, but we still have a long way to go. And only technology really has the scale to really solve the problems that we're facing. And we can talk later, for example, I believe we will solve the energy and global warming problem within about 20 years using nanotechnology. And there's really no other way to do it. So these technologies enable us to solve problems and overcome suffering. And basically, I see that as the grand goal, purpose of human civilization, to go beyond our limitations and fundamentally to expand human knowledge. No other species has knowledge, and our knowledge base is literally doubling every year with this, 50 different ways to measure it, but no matter how you measure it, we find the doubling time is 11 months, 12 months, 13 months, depending on what you're measuring. And we need our technology just to hold it and keep track of it and search through it, and we're going to need more intelligent search engines to really find it, knowledge based on concepts and so on. So expanding our intelligence, which we've already done. I mean, even though most of the computers are not yet inside our bodies and brains, they will make their way into our bodies and brains, but most of them are not, although if you're a Parkinson's patient, you can have a computer put inside your brain that replaces the biological neurons that are destroyed by that disease. And the latest generation actually allows you to download new software to your computer inside your brain from outside the patient. So that's for Parkinson's patients, but ultimately when we can send computers inside our brain through the capillaries non-invasively, which will be feasible in the 2020s, we will be amplifying quite directly our own intelligence. But we routinely do it now with the tools that we have at our fingertips. I mean, just think how quickly you find knowledge about a professor or some product that you hear about with search engines. And think back 5 years ago, people didn't use search engines. Now that sounds like ancient history. I mean, imagine life without search engines. But that was 5 years ago. 3 years ago, we didn't have blogs. At least people didn't talk about them. There was no social networks, no podcasts. A lot of things have changed in just a few years' time. So we are expanding at an accelerating pace our own frontiers and our own capability. And fundamentally, we need to get smarter by amplifying our intelligence with this mental amplifier, which is our technology, in order to continue this grand quest to expand human knowledge. And I define knowledge quite broadly to include music, art, as well as science, technology, and so on.
Our guest is going to be with us for the next 2 hours and 45 minutes. If you want to ask him your questions about his writings or his thoughts on the future of technology, here are the numbers. For those of you in the Eastern and Central time zones, it is 202-737-0001. And for those of you who live in the Mountain and Pacific time zones, 202-737-0002. You can also email your thoughts to him. That email, booktv@c-span.org. Essentially, man and machine will become one in the future?
Well, let me describe how that will happen. We're going to send blood cell-sized devices inside our bloodstream, inside our bodies, and also inside our brains through the capillaries to do two things. One, to keep us healthier, to reverse atherosclerosis, destroy pathogens, remove debris, correct DNA errors. If that sounds very futuristic, I point out we are doing at least the first generation of that already in animals. One scientist cured type 1 diabetes with a blood cell-sized device that lets insulin out in a controlled fashion. Scientists at MIT have a blood cell-sized device that actually destroys cancer cells by detecting the antigens on their surface, burrowing inside, releasing toxins, and destroying the cell. I mean, this is today. And take this billion-fold magnification or expansion that I talked about in a quarter century of the capabilities of information technology, computers and communication, and apply that to what we can already do. And in 25 years, we'll have these nanobots, blood cell-sized devices, will be very sophisticated. They'll be capable of keeping us healthy from inside and also interacting directly with our biological neurons. We've already shown that that's feasible. And expanding human intelligence.
How small are nanobots?
Well, blood cell size. Nano refers to a billionth of a meter, but that means the key features are measured in some modest number of nanometers. A nanometer is the width of 5 carbon atoms, but it doesn't mean that the nanobot is 1 that the nanobot is 1 nanometer, it means that the features are measured in a modest number, 5, 10, 20 nanometers. The whole device is actually microns, millionths of a meter, which is the size of a blood cell. And a blood cell is basically a nano robot, and it can be quite sophisticated. A white blood cell is actually intelligent, can detect friend from foe and devise strategies to destroy it. But there's one actually there's a couple of deficiencies, but there's one significant deficiency of our white blood cells. I've actually watched my own white blood cells in a microscope. They're very slow. Biology is actually quite sluggish. It took my white blood cell an hour and a half to destroy this bacteria on a slide. And I think it was operating at full speed. Ultimately, these nanorobots will be able to do that in seconds. They won't be subject to autoimmune disorders. They can download software from the internet to combat specific pathogens. If that sounds very futuristic, I'd point out there's lots of devices we're putting inside the body and brain now, today, that download software from outside the body, like this implant for Parkinson's patients. So as these devices get smaller, according to my models, we're shrinking technology at an exponential rate, a rate of 100 per 3D volume per decade. So in 25 years, these devices will be 100,000 times smaller in terms of key features, and they'll be 1 billion times more capable, and they're already pretty impressive.
If that plays out, where does human end and machine begin, and how, I guess, is there a moral question when you combine those two?
Not in my mind. I mean, we're the species that goes beyond our limitations. And so expanding our horizons with our tools is really what human civilization is all about. I mean, we have a cerebral cortex that can do abstract reasoning, so we can look at that stone and say, hey, I could combine that stone with that stick and create a tool that extends my leverage. We have an opposable appendage that actually works. Other chimpanzees' hands look similar, but it's actually not very well designed. They don't have a power grip. They don't have fine motor coordination. They just aren't quite at that level to create technology. And they use tools, but the tools never evolve. So we've been able to actually create tools and technology, and then we always use the latest technology to create the next. That's why the process accelerates. And that has been its own evolutionary process. And that has enabled us to expand our horizons. Now, if you ask a Parkinson's patient whether that neural implant is part of him or her, maybe different people would answer differently, but it's very much actually part of their sense of identity. Because they used to be able to do things, then they had the disease, and they developed certain disabilities, and then this implant, when it's successful, which it often is, allows them again to do what they used to do. They're delighted to consider that part of themselves.
If machines, as you say, will become more human in their reasoning, is it going to change our relationship that we have to computers and machines right now? They're typically impersonal things that sit in our desk. Is that going to change?
Absolutely. I mean, machines, and that's a grand trend that's underway. I mean, machines used to be very remote. I mean, you couldn't deal with them at all unless you were a technician. And when I went to MIT in 1965, there was one big computer in an air-conditioned room, and you couldn't get close to it. And you had to be pretty much of an expert to have any interaction with it. And then we had the personal computing revolution. And now these devices are family friendly. They're in our pockets, carry them under our arms. They're really extensions of ourselves. Search engines really enable us to find information quite easily. The next revolution is going to be a certain amount of natural language understanding. These machines will be able to deal with normal conversation, not at human levels, but enough to actually find information and do routine transactions. So they're getting friendlier and friendlier. So they're moving more towards us rather than us having to move towards a classical concept of what a machine is, which is kind of a 19th century concept of something that's not very warm and fuzzy. But machines are getting more complex. I mean, we have trillions of moving parts in a human being, and a 19th century machine had maybe hundreds or thousands of parts. Now they have billions of parts, still not at human levels, but they're moving in that direction because of this exponential expansion. And it's worth making another point, which is people say you can't predict the future. And that's kind of the common wisdom. And it is, in fact, not possible to predict specific projects, specific people, but the overall impact of information technology turns out to be very predictable. For example, the price performance of computing, let's say the cost of a MIPS of computing. MIPS is million instructions per second. I have a graph in the book that goes back to 1890, a very smooth exponential progression, despite wars and peace and war and depressions and boom times and the Cold War, and through all those vagaries of human history, we have very smooth, very predictable exponential progressions. And you have there The Age of Intelligent Machines, which was my first book I wrote 20 years ago, that has hundreds of predictions about the 1990s and early 2000 years based on these models, based on this very predictable exponential progression of information technology. And they've tracked quite accurately. Many of those predictions were quite controversial at the time. And you might wonder, well, how could this be? I mean, how can we make reliable predictions about the overall impact of information technology when each specific project, each company, each person is unpredictable? And we see other examples in science of that. I mean, thermodynamics, you have a gas made up of a lot of unpredictable particles. Each particle is, in fact, modeled by a random walk. You can't predict where one molecule will be 10 seconds from now. But the overall gas is very predictable, according to the laws of thermodynamics, to a very high degree of precision. So if you have a large, dynamic, chaotic system where each element is unpredictable, the overall system can have some very predictable properties. And that's really and technology evolution is just such a dynamic system where we can make these reliable predictions, despite the fact that every specific project and every specific individual is unpredictable. And that's really the basis of the predictions I've made. And I've been using these models for 3 decades.
As you look at the future, what are important dates then for us to consider about your thoughts on the future of technology?
Well, by 2020, $1,000 of computation will equal the 10 to the 16th, 10 million billion calculations per second that I estimate is required to simulate the whole human brain. But that actually won't by itself achieve human levels of intelligence. We'll need the software of human intelligence. And we're going to get that in a number of ways, but one of the important ways is actually by reverse engineering the human brain, and that'll take a bit longer. So I've been very consistent in saying 2029 we'll have a computer that can pass the Turing test. This was a test devised by Alan Turing to ascertain whether a computer was actually achieving human levels of intelligence. And in the Turing test, you have a human judge interviews a computer and a human using basically instant messaging, so the judge can't see the human and the computer, and just chats with them. You know, what movie did you see? What do you think of the principal character? And if after a few hours of this dialogue, the human judge can't tell the difference between the two, you know, can't tell which one is the computer and which one is the human, we say the computer has passed the Turing test. And I believe that will happen in 2029. And it's actually a good test. There's no simple trick with language or simple, you know, computational trick you could deploy to enable a computer to pass that test without actually giving it the equivalent of human intelligence.
San Diego, California. Good morning.
Thank you, C-SPAN. This is Albert Torres, and I want to know 2 questions, basically. The one's going to be answered really quick. You could just give me like an arbitrary percentage. And the second one you can just expand on. Basically, I want to know how much do you think of the technology that's currently being created is used for military use? And secondly, are you aware of any connections between some of the research that's been going on between quantum mechanics and spirituality about like movies like What the Bleep, basically things that are trying to prove the existence of God?
Okay, well, let's see if we can make some estimates. I mean, here in the United States, our military budget order of magnitude is maybe $500 billion, and our gross national product order of magnitude is about $10 trillion, but let's say 3 or 4 trillion of that is technology related. So maybe 1/6 of our technology efforts go into military applications in this country, and that's probably a high percentage compared to other countries because we have such a large military establishment. So that's an off-the-cuff estimate. You bring up actually a pretty rich issue. Quantum mechanics, at least some interpretations of quantum mechanics, bear some relationship to Eastern or Buddhist thoughts where the principal reality is actually human awareness. and that we actually create the world with our awareness, because at least according to certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, a particle actually doesn't decide where it is. It can be in many different places. But when we observe it, we resolve that quantum ambiguity, and reality actually becomes manifest as a result of observation by a conscious observer. There are other interpretations of quantum mechanics, but it's interesting that there actually is a meeting of the minds between certain schools of Eastern thought with certain interpretations of quantum mechanics. And there's also, there's been speculation by scientists such as Roger Penrose that human consciousness arises from quantum interactions that take place in our brain. People pointed out to Penrose, well, the brain is actually a pretty messy place, and the neurons are not really at the right scale for quantum events to take place, or for there to be quantum ambiguity or quantum entanglement. So he came up with a theory that the tubules, which are very fine structures within the neurons, do quantum computing. That remains controversial. We've never actually detected quantum computing inside the human brain. My own feeling is, if we look at what human beings are capable of, we don't see evidence that we're doing quantum computing, because quantum computing would be able to simultaneously consider every possible combination of solutions to a problem simultaneously. And the kinds of things that humans do seem to be explained by more classical computing. But this remains both a technical and controversial area. I would approach spirituality a little differently. I mean, I'm quite enamored with the powers of evolution. In fact, we can use evolution in a computer and actually simulate evolution, and the computer will actually evolve an intelligent solution to a problem. It's really quite amazing. We let millions of solutions compete in a simulated environment, and it comes after hundreds of generations. It actually evolves a surprising and intelligent solution to a problem. So biological evolution gave rise to a technology creating species, and evolution is actually capable of creating more complex, more intelligent entities than you started with. And then the technology creating species has ushered in this whole evolutionary process of technology. And that has enabled us to, and that is actually the cutting edge of evolution right now on Earth. I mean, biological evolution is continuing, but we are making 1,000 times faster progress with technological evolution. And ultimately, that is the way which we're going to lift ourselves up. And what happens in an evolutionary process? Well, things get more complicated. The entities actually get more knowledgeable. They get more creative. They actually get more beautiful. They get more capable of higher level emotions like love. So they become, more knowledgeable, more creative, more beautiful, all the things that have been attributed to God in our religious traditions without limit. And an evolutionary process actually never reaches infinite levels, but it explodes exponentially, and so it seems to be becoming infinite. Literally stays finite, but it explodes in capability, moving closer to that ideal of infinite knowledge, infinite intelligence. So you could say that evolution is a spiritual process, and I believe that's the case. I mean, you asked before what is the purpose of all this, and I really see it as a spiritual process to expand knowledge, but knowledge is not just information, it's not just dry fact. Knowledge is expressions of a loving sentiment, art, music, science, the grand expressions of human civilization, and that is a spiritual quest, in my view.
One of your titles of your books is called The Age of Spiritual Machines. What do you mean by a spiritual machine?
Well, I was making two allusions. One is to this concept of spirituality that I just articulated, that an evolutionary process, starting with biology and now with technology, is actually moving towards greater levels of intelligence and therefore becoming more like God, at least moving in that spiritual direction of greater intelligence. So we could say it's a spiritual process. But there was another allusion. I mean, what do we mean when people say, well, a person has a soul? They're really referring to consciousness, the fact that I'm aware of my own existence. I'm not just aware of it, I feel it, and I feel the emotions associated with it. And these emotions are not just technical states, they're rich in meaning. And that is, so human beings, I mean, are a machine. I mean, a neuron is a collection of molecules and ion channels, and you can describe, and we are, in fact, describing those in very precise terms. And you put 100 billion of them together in a very specific way, and you create a human being. And a lot of people would consider a human being to be a spiritual machine. Well, we're going to be able to recreate the powers of human intelligence, all of the subtlety and suppleness of human intelligence in a machine. And therefore, those machines, I mean, if human beings, in fact, are spiritual machines, and those machines that emulate human intelligence and have the same complexity and are based on the design of human intelligence will share in that property. And then you ask the question, okay, well, is a machine like that conscious? Well, how can you tell? Well, let's ask the machine. Are you conscious? So the machine says, yeah, I'm conscious. Well, a machine could say that today. Do you believe it? Well, today you don't believe it. When a character in a video game says, I'm very jealous or I'm very angry at you, you don't really take it seriously because we can see the edges of its intelligence. They're not fully convincing. They don't have all the subtle cues that go along with that emotion. So we don't really believe that they're really conscious. We think they're just a software program. But the point of my thesis is that as we get out to the late 2020s, early 2030s, these machines will be so complex and so rich in their emotional reactions and so realistic in their recreations of human intelligence that when they talk about their feelings, they will have all the subtle cues, and we will be convinced by them. But ultimately, this is not a philosophical proof that they are conscious. Consciousness is a synonym for subjectivity, and science is really objectivity and rational deductions from our objective observation. And there's a gap between science, objectivity, and subjectivity. And there's really no scientific test we can postulate that we could slide an entity in and a green light comes on. Okay, this one's conscious. No, this one's not conscious. We could build a machine like that, but it would have philosophical assumptions built into it. So John Searle would make sure that it's squirting neurotransmitters, and Roger Penrose would make sure that it had something equivalent to the tubules during quantum computing, and other scientists or philosophers would make other assumptions. But there's really no objective way to absolutely answer that question. And we don't even know that other people are conscious, but we assume that. But actually, when we go outside of shared human experience, talk about, for example, animals, we're not sure, or at least we disagree. And we'll have disagreements about these machines.
Someone who disagrees with you is on the line from Knoxville, Tennessee.
Hello. I am a material scientist. I work at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. I'm a big fan of Book TV, and the reason I'm calling today is to express my disappointment that you have invited this highly sophisticated crackpot and given him a national forum to express his pseudo-religious predictions that have no basis in objective reality. And I'll just point out two big problems with what he says. The first is that he believes evolution is progressive, but he offers no evidence for this claim. He says that it's getting more complex, but he doesn't offer an objective measurement of complexity that he can show is following some trend. And even if there is a trend, random phenomena can produce things that look like trends. It doesn't mean that there is one there. You have to show that we were produced, our species was produced, not from random mutations, which we know this is how natural selection works. He presents a plot in his book where he shows it exponentially accelerating. He uses species and genus and family and group that our species came from. But you can produce the exact same plot for any species. They'll all show exponentially accelerating trends if you just use their taxonomic branching points. I'm sorry to get technical here. It does not prove that we were the products of an exponential trend. It actually arises out of the statistics of natural selection. The second point is that small is almost always more expensive. Imagine if you were asked to produce a replica of the chair that you're sitting on. You could probably go to Home Depot and get the tools to do this, and it wouldn't be that expensive. Now imagine if I asked you to produce a replica of the same chair, except that is the size of a grain of salt. How would you do this? What tools would you buy? You'd maybe use a couple lasers to polymerize the liquid, but it would be much more expensive. And this is the trend. A corollary to Moore's law is Moore's second law, which is that these production facilities are getting exponentially more expensive. It doesn't matter what you do, just from the second law of thermodynamics, small is going to be more expensive. I have also problems with Mr. Kurzweil's estimation of the computational power of the human brain. He doesn't consider processes like phosphorylation, where individual proteins can act as molecular switches.
Okay, caller, thank you.
Well, you bring up a number of interesting issues. If we look at biological evolution, go back billions of years, and bacteria, single-celled organisms were the cutting edge, were the most complex and most intelligent entities. We then went to multicellular organisms. We then went to more and more complex ones like lizards, and then finally mammals, and then primates that actually had, and then there was the evolution of cognitive functions, and then the evolution of Homo sapiens. There's been a continual acceleration at every pace. Evolution works through indirection. It creates a capability and then it uses that, and that's why the process accelerates. So it took 1 billion years to evolve DNA. Actually, RNA came first. Then evolution used DNA. So the Cambrian explosion and all the body plans of the animals evolved only took about 10 million years. And then higher cognitive functions evolved in only a few million years. And then Homo sapiens evolved in only a few 100,000 years. And then we moved to technology evolution, where the first stages like stone tools, fire, the wheel, took only tens of thousands of years. And that has continued to accelerate because we always use the latest technology to create the next. 50 years ago, computers were designed pen on paper, wired with screwdrivers. It took years to design the first computers. We now use computers and 10th generation computer-assisted design software to design computers, and you can design a new computer system in days. And there's been a continual acceleration, and I review that in a number of different ways. And in terms of your points on nanotechnology, the key features of technology have been getting smaller and smaller. We don't have the tools now to create full-scale, massively parallel molecular nanotechnology today, but we're moving in that direction. The key features of technology are getting smaller, declining by about 100 per 3D volume per decade, and I make that case in the book. At that rate, we will get to full-scale molecular nanotechnology in about 20 years. At that point, we'll be able to create macro objects, designing them at the molecular level, and these will be self-organizing. The counter trend to the second Moore's law, where these fabrication facilities get more and more expensive, is that chips will be self-organizing. And that was actually a controversial notion when my book Age of Spiritual Machines came out in '99. There's been so much progress in that it's very much a mainstream view. You can talk to the Intel scientists. In fact, I was just at IBM recently, and they showed me some self-organizing molecular circuits that are beginning to work in 3 dimensions. A nanotube-based memory is actually going to hit the market next year, which uses self-organizing features. So we are actually moving in the direction of being able to create in very small facilities, desktop facilities, that can actually create 3-dimensional circuits that are not chips, but are actually self-organizing, that self-diagnosing work. The latest generation chips actually has self-healing and self-diagnostic capabilities because they're so massive that they don't want to throw the whole chip away because one transistor is broken, so they're actually able to route information around that information. The internet is based on that. The internet hasn't gone down for 1 second in 10 years because information routes around damaged portions. So, I mean, the whole book makes the case for these exponential trends quite extensively through 600 pages. I can't summarize all of it.
So going back to the concept of what he brought up of nanotechnology, is it fair to say it's a little robot? Is that what we're talking about when we're talking about a nanobot or whatever?
Nanotechnology is being able to design technology where the key features are a few nanometers, or at least less than 100 nanometers in scale. So electronics has already actually passed that threshold. Right now, the key features in chips are 65 nanometers. There's already chips working under 50 nanometers. If you look at the Intel's and the semiconductor industry's roadmap, by 2020, the chips will have 4 nanometer features. That's about 20 carbon atoms. So, and another key step is that we'll go from the second dimension into the third dimension. Chips today are flat. We live in a 3-dimensional world. We might as well use a third dimension. And that is going to, we will ultimately run out of speed or steam with Moore's law, shrinking the key features on a flat circuit, we'll need to go into the third dimension. That's going to be the next paradigm, actually the sixth paradigm in electronics. And chip designers, if you talk to the Intel scientists as I have, they're very confident that the crossover point between 2 dimensions and 3 will be in the teen years, well before we run out of steam with Moore's law. So electronics is going to be revolutionized by being able to build electronic circuits as well as communication devices in 3 dimensions at the molecular level using self-organizing circuits. We'll also be able to create small devices that have mechanical capabilities, that have computers and communications built in, and these can go inside the human body, keep us healthy from inside. This can be one major application. And there's already significant harbingers of that we can see. There's 4 major conferences on something called BioMEMS, Biological Microelectronic Mechanical Systems. Dozens of experiments are placing blood cell-sized devices in the bloodstream of animals to produce, in some cases, very sophisticated therapeutic effects, and that's today. And if you apply this billion-fold increase in the price, performance, and capability and bandwidth of electronics, communication, and 100,000-fold shrinking of mechanical technology over the next quarter century, you get some idea of what will be feasible.
San Francisco is next with a question about voice technology.
Hi, I have a question. I'm a retired court reporter, and I'm very interested in what the status is of verbatim real-time voice recognition technology, specifically translation into text that could be purchased by the consumer. And if you could address the legal and privacy issues that might restrict use of the technology, such as, recording conversations. For instance, in California, it's illegal without the consent of both parties. And the second part of my question is, will this technology, do you see it playing some role in transparency of government and politicians, perhaps on the internet, to provide the consumer and the citizenry a better line into what's going on with government? Thank you.
Well, you bring up some interesting issues. In fact, speech recognition is widely used today for surveillance by intelligence agencies, because they do listen in one way or another to millions of conversations around the world. We don't have enough people to actually listen to them, so we use speech recognition. They use speech recognition to try to actually interpret what people are saying. And you'll run into speech recognition on the phone. There are millions of people that use speech recognition to create their written documents. I put together a prototype with my company in the 80s, created the first large vocabulary speech recognition. We took a contemporary version of that, combined it with speech synthesis and language translation to create a translating telephone.
And actually, we have a demonstration of that, available for our viewers.
One of my companies, we developed the first text-to-speech synthesis. That was the company that developed the first reading machine. This was in the 70s. And another company that I started developed the first large vocabulary speech recognition that was actually commercially marketed. And I put those two together with some contemporary language translation software and created a translating telephone. And I've actually used this to communicate with people in other countries. And this will be a routine service of your cell phone in a few years, early in the next decade.
This is a demonstration, comma.
Dies ist eine Demonstration.
Of a prototype of a quote translating end quote telephone. Period.
Von einem Prototyp eines übersetzenden Telefons.
Within a few years, comma.
Innerhalb einiger Jahre.
We will be able to talk to anyone, comma.
Wir werden fähig sein, zu jemandem zu reden.
Regardless of their language. Period.
Ohne Rücksicht auf ihre Sprache.
The translations aren't perfect, but some of them are actually quite good. Human translators are better, but because human translators aren't always available. Now, for important UN discussions, they use human translators, but this would be a routine way to communicate around the world.
Merci pour votre attention. Period.
Thank you for your attention.
And what year will that become commonplace, do you think?
I think early in the next decade. This will be a routine service of your cell phone and communicators. Of course, we have language translation software already on the internet. It varies in quality. The better systems are actually quite good. I was out at Google and they showed me an English to Arabic and Arabic to English translator they had put together because they have these very large Rosetta Stone texts where they have the same text translated in English and in the other language, in this case Arabic. And they can use pattern recognition software to automatically find the translation rules. They didn't actually tell it how to translate. They let the software find its own rules. And this system actually compared well to human translators, and nobody on the team that created it spoke a word of Arabic. So the system actually found its own rules. And so language translation is getting better. We have an emailer, and I don't have the email, but he says, what kind of technology do you use personally? Well, I use remote desktop to actually always be on my computer at work because I don't want to have multiple copies of my files. So I take around a little notebook and connect through high-speed connection, whether I'm in a town car or in a hotel room, and I'm on my computer at work. I use search engines. I use both Google and Microsoft. And I use pretty routine technologies, different databases, nothing too exotic, but actually actually have one interesting technology that's a virtual reality technology, enables me to be at another venue in 3D. And a third of my speeches I actually give using this virtual reality technology. It's called Teleportech. And I appear at the venue in 3 dimensions, life-size. I can move around. As I move around, the audience sees the local background behind me, so it looks like I'm there. And it's pretty convincing. One guy actually walked up to me to give me a question on a piece of paper. And I'm actually the only speaker in the world that has one in my office, because I get invited to give speeches in Asia and Europe and Australia, and I can't always go there. And this is expensive technology today. We have to send a technician with the other half of the equipment to the venue and set up communication lines. This will actually be routine, ubiquitous technology early in the next decade. We'll have images written directly to our retina from our eyeglasses. They'll be able to create virtual reality environments, either overlaying real reality, so I'll have pop-up displays. When I see you, there'll be a little pop-up saying, reminding me it's your birthday next Tuesday, or reminding me what your name is, or reminding me where a building is that I'm looking for, or completely overtake the visual field of view and create a virtual reality environment so you and I could meet in a virtual Cancun beach, even if we're hundreds of miles apart, and we'll feel just like we're there. This will actually be routine technology in the second decade of this. As it gets more complex, though, if you give speeches thousands of miles away, doesn't it take out the personal element of human communication? And isn't that one of the key components of being human, I guess, being able to communicate? No, actually, it's doing the opposite. It's enhancing human communication, because I can communicate. I mean, they see me in real time. It's not recorded. It's real time. I see the audience. I can establish eye contact, like I'm doing now. I can point at people, and the technology actually works correctly. And this is how this future virtual reality technology will work also. But we have early versions of that already. I mean, the telephone was the first virtual reality technology that enabled you to be with someone else just as if you were together, even if you were hundreds of miles apart, and that had never happened before in human history. And that's actually how they saw it. I mean, before that, you had to actually get together to talk to someone. And those are not virtual. I mean, the word virtual is unfortunate, as if these aren't real conversations. You can't say, well, that wasn't a real agreement I made. That was in the virtual reality environment called the telephone. No, I mean, those are real conversations between real people communicating. And the internet now, because of its decentralized nature and the fact that it's everywhere, allows us to create communities based on common interests. So if someone has, let's say, a chronic disease, they can create communities of other people and gather information and stay abreast of that condition around the world, or any subject, whether it's collecting cat figurines, which I do. I can be in touch with all the other cat figurine lovers around the world and create a community. So we're not stuck with the communities of geographic accidents, the people that happen to be near us, we can create communities with people around the world. And you go around, you see people on their cell phones and on their communicators and on their notebooks, and they are communicating not just with the people in their vicinity, but with groups around the world, and also enhances work environments. I mean, I have work groups that are spread out geographically, and we work very effectively together, and that wasn't feasible 10 years ago.
You brought up virtual reality. With that in mind, who is Ramona?
Well, this is a project that started a number of years ago. She's a female, she's my female alter ego. And I wanted to demonstrate at this conference called TED, Technology, Entertainment, Design, at the 2001 TED conference, a feature of virtual reality that you can be someone else. Because I mentioned that, you know, you and I could go into a virtual reality environment and take a walk on a virtual Cancun beach in virtual reality environments. And we'll have virtual bodies in these virtual reality environments, particularly when it's through the nervous system. When we have nanobots in our brains that can shut down the signals coming from our real senses, replace them with the signals that your brain would be receiving if you were in the virtual environment, then it'll feel like you're in that virtual environment. And design of new virtual environments will be a new art form. And as I go to move my hand, it'll move my virtual hand. And so I can be an actor in this virtual environment. We can shake hands and we give each other a hug, or we can run on the beach or sit down at a desk and have experiences in these virtual reality environments. But your body doesn't have to be the same body that you have in real reality. A couple could become each other, for example. And so I wanted to demonstrate how you could do that. So I had magnetic sensors in my clothing. As I moved, a life-size, realistic, real-time animation, pretty photorealistic, of Ramona moved exactly the way I did. My voice was changed into her voice using some other computer technology, and that drove her lips. And so it looked like she was giving the presentation, but I was actually being transformed into her. And the audience could see me and her. And
actually, we have a demonstration to show the folks at home.
Well, in virtual reality, you can be who you want to be, and you can be where you want to be and with whom you want to be, and you can even have been who you want to have been. Well, my childhood was kind of tough, although I didn't really think about that at the time. You know, you don't really have much to compare to, but my pa, he was always trying hard, but he never did seem to be able to hold on to a job. Well, I haven't written that many songs, but I try to express what's most deeply on my mind. In virtual reality, you can be someone else. You don't have to be the same boring person all the time. I mean, you all have these personalities inside you that don't quite fit with your bodies in real reality. So basically, most people just, like, kill them all off. Some people don't actually keep any of their personalities, which reminds me of some of my old boyfriends, but that's another story.
Mr. Kurzweil.
So this is actually a serious project that I intend to continue with and actually make Ramona more realistic and actually more independent. I have this bet with Mitch Caper that a computer will pass the Turing test by 2029, and I intend that to be Ramona, actually an independent version of Ramona, who would, because a computer that passes the Turing test is not some so dry, lifeless box. It'll have a personality and an appearance, and it'll be just like a human. And so this is actually a project that I intend to continue with to make Ramona more lifelike and more realistic over time.
If you're interested in finding out more, a sample of Ramona is available on the website that is kurzweilai.net. If you want to go to that website and check it out for yourself. Terre Haute, Indiana, good morning, or good afternoon.
Hi. First of all, Ray, I just want to say I'm a big fan of yours, and I appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you.
I was curious. I know that your ideas have been met with a lot of skepticism from those in the scientific community as well as various scholars. I'm wondering if you're noticing more of an upsurgence in the acceptance of your ideas, such as particularly the law of accelerating returns, if it's being more accepted overall since, say, just when you published the Spiritual Machines in '99, just the past 6 or 7 years, have you noticed more of an acceptance overall of the ideas you're trying to get out there?
Yes, definitely. And I think the acceleration of the pace of paradigm shift is becoming quite noticeable. We now see dramatic changes in just a few years' time, and that wasn't so noticeable 10 years ago. And this exponential explosion of electronics and information technology is now apparent to the common person because we're all using these devices, from digital cameras to iPods to social networks. And people see how their capabilities change and today's limitations get overcome in a short period of time. And also the various predictions I made in Age of Spiritual Machines, which was 1999, have really tracked quite accurately in terms of the power of computation, the power of the internet, the power of communication technology, progress we're making in nanotechnology. And I've had the opportunity to share these ideas with leadership scientific communities. I was recently invited to give the keynote at the off-site meeting of the directors of the National Institutes of Health and the chief scientists, and we were able to talk for actually a couple hours about these kinds of ideas, and I would say they're very much on the same page because they're experiencing this exponential growth. For example, the first genome cost $1 billion. They're not talking about collecting 1 million genomes at $1,000 each. It cost $10 per base pair in 1990. It's a penny today. So I mean, they're experiencing this exponential progression in price performance and capacity and every other aspect of information technology. And it's not just electronics, it's every aspect of information, whether it's brain data or the resolution of brain scanners. Or the Genome Project was controversial in 1990. It was not a mainstream project. The mainstream skeptics said this isn't going to work. We collected 1/10,000th of the genome in 1989. And well, we doubled the amount of genetic data we've sequenced every year. That's continued past the end of the Genome Project. We're going to be able to collect everyone's genome. So, I mean, things that were unheard of just a few years ago are now becoming commonplace.
When you say the law of accelerating returns, does that mean, in essence, that technology is getting smaller and cheaper and more efficient to operate?
The law of accelerating returns deals with measurable attributes of information technology and basically says that the power of information technology, measured in many different ways, price performance, capacity, bandwidth, of information technology, not just in computers, but in all these different fields, it doubles every year. Now, depending on what you're measuring, the doubling time might be 12 months or 11 months or 13 months, but it's exponential. And people think in linear terms. They think that the current pace will just continue at the rate that it's going now. And they don't take into consideration this exponential explosion. Exponential growth is seductive, but when you start doubling big numbers, it becomes quite explosive.
We have 2 hours with our guest, with more of your calls to talk with Ray Kurzweil. We're going to take a look at some of the technology that he employs in his lab. When he comes back, more of your calls and questions for him.
So what is Kurzweil Technologies?
Well, my field is pattern recognition, teaching computers to recognize patterns. And that's actually, in my opinion, the bulk of human intelligence. That's what humans do well. But computers are mastering that as well. So my first project was character recognition, teaching a computer to recognize any type style. That was actually the first time that was done. And then I did large vocabulary speech recognition. And we've applied pattern recognition to other types of patterns, EKG, heart signals, financial data. We have a company that looks at that. And that's really, I think, the most important area of artificial intelligence. And ultimately, when we create a machine that will be at human levels, it will be because computers have mastered human levels of pattern recognition. But that's been my interest. So I've started about 10 companies commercializing and developing different aspects of pattern recognition.
Right behind you, we can see over your shoulder is a screen that is doing artwork as you talk. What is that?
Well, that was actually created by another computer scientist, Harold Cohen, who's worked for 30 years on actually mastering at least one style of human art. He has thousands of rules about how to create a painting. And this is a technology we've sponsored. And you can download it at kurzweilcyberart.com for free. Every painting is different, and it's actually won awards in museums. But every 2 minutes, it's painting a different picture.
In the corner, you have an Edison voice writer.
Yes, well, Edison's actually a good model for what we're trying to do, because he was continually coming up with creative ideas, thinking about what technology could do in the future, and working on lots of different inventions, really to recreate sound and visual world using the technology at that time. He created the first motion picture and the first phonograph record. This is actually an early phonograph record where you could actually record and play both music, and it was also used for business correspondence. You could do dictation on it.
And over here, there's something that looks like a human being but is not a human being.
Well, it's sort of symbolic of what we ultimately are trying to do, which is to recreate human performance. So he's, by looking somewhat realistic, is a symbol of that. And so we've worked on trying to recreate human speech recognition, different aspects of human vision in our reading machines. We're actually going to be adding not just the ability to read print, but actually recognize objects to our reading machine. So a blind person can just hold the camera pointed at a room, and it'll actually tell him or her what's in the room, identify the objects and the people. So we're trying to recreate human skills.
There's a medal down on a table here and a picture of you with President Clinton. Can you tell that story?
Well, it's not much of a story. It's when I got the National Medal of Technology from the president. But that was a nice experience. This is actually a cartoon I commissioned in 1965, 40 years ago. And I had an interest in artificial intelligence at that time. And so this is a cartoon I designed. It was implemented by an artist friend of mine. And it pokes fun at, or at least it comments on the nature of human experience. That brain is obviously having experiences in a virtual reality environment, because it doesn't look like it's having much fun. But we live inside our brains, and ultimately we'll actually be able to have our brain feel like it's in some other environment rather than the environment we're in. For example, the nanobots could shut down the signals coming from our real senses, replace them with the signals that we would be receiving if we were in a virtual environment. And then our brain will actually feel like it's not in the environment that it's really in, but it would be in some virtual world. And it'll be just as convincing as real reality. And we'll have a virtual body. You've got to move your hand, it'll move your virtual hand. And it will feel very real. So that's actually, and that'll be feasible in 20 years or so. And that'll actually be a realization of this cartoon, which I designed 40 years ago.
Ray Kurzweil, on those stills was listed your junior high and high school teachers. Is anything that they taught you back when you were in school relevant to what you do today? Something that you remember that still sticks with you?
I think they were encouraging me to pursue my own ideas. I mean, that's why I put them down there. And they gave me the idea that I could they empowered me to just go off and spend most of my time doing my own projects, which I did on my spare time and while I was in school. I mean, under my textbook, which would be open, I'd be actually working on some project in junior high school and high school. My parents were very encouraging. My father was a musician, my mother is an artist, but they very much encouraged me to pursue my own ideas in computers. And I decided I would be an inventor when I was 5. And
how did you know that?
Well, that's a good question. Maybe a few more years of analysis will reveal that. I just had this fascination that you could put things together and create some kind of transcendence. I didn't have that word back then, but that you could create some kind of powerful effect. I started building a rocket ship, but actually quickly got into virtual reality. When I was 7 or 8, I created a mechanical virtual reality, a puppet theater, and I had this command station where I could control the world and move scenery in, bring the moon down, or bring a character on stage from this one command station. So that was kind of my first virtual reality project. But I had this conceit. I knew what I was going to be. Other kids were wondering, well, what should they be? A fireman or a nurse? And I said, well, I know what I'm going to be. And I never wavered in that confidence.
And your parents were, once they knew, were they okay with that?
They were more than okay. They were very enthusiastic, and there was this idea that science was important. It was just emerging back then, but this was actually before Kennedy's charge to the nation with science. But, and, you know, they were struggling artists, but they always provided me the resources to create my own inventions, which actually got to be somewhat expensive.
In one of the openings of the books, you said that you were influenced by Tom Swift books. Who's Tom Swift?
Yeah, well, I read all the Tom Swift Jr. books when I was 8, 9, and 10. I just recently discovered there was actually Tom Swift Sr. books that were written around 1900. But the plots were always the same. Tom Swift would get into trouble, and usually the future of the human race hung in the balance also. And he would retire to his lair, his basement, and come up with some invention, some idea that would save the day. And the moral was that no matter what kind of problem you face, there's an idea that can overcome it, and you can find that idea. And that was actually very much almost a religion in my household. I remember my grandfather coming back from Europe talking about how he had the opportunity to handle some documents by Leonardo da Vinci with his own hands, and he talked about it with reverence, that really the power of human ideas to change the world was very much a mantra in my family, and that has impressed me. And that is my view, that if you encounter problems, any kind of problems, you can find the idea to overcome that problem. And that's really our mission here as part of the human civilization, to address the problems that we face and find the ideas to overcome them. And it's really, as I mentioned earlier, only technology that has the scale to overcome problems if we find the right set of ideas.
We looked a little bit at your company during the break, but part of the history of your company includes the artist Stevie Wonder.
Right. Well, my first major invention was a print-to-speech reading machine for the blind. He was actually our first customer. He caught me on the Today Show and actually called us up, said he wanted to drop over and get one. We were just finishing one up. So he came over, we spent the day showing him how to use it, and he left with it in his taxi. It was pretty big. It was almost as big as he was. But he was our first customer. And so I became friends with him. This was 1976, so this was 30 years ago. And in 1982, we had a conversation about the world of music. He was showing me around his new studio, Wonderland, and lamenting that there were these two disconnected worlds of musical instruments. There was the acoustic world with these beautiful sounds like piano and guitar and violin, but you couldn't control those sounds. In fact, most musicians couldn't even play them at all. And if you could play a violin, you could only play one note at a time, and so on. And then there was this electronic world where you could play polyphonically, and you could have the computer remember what you played and play it back and play another line over it, and you could modify the sounds. But the sounds you had to work with were very thin, electrical sounding sounds back in '82. Wouldn't it be great if we could combine these powerful computer control methods with these beautiful sounds of choice of acoustic instruments. And so that was the goal of Kurzweil Music. I felt using pattern recognition, signal processing, that was feasible. And with Stevie Wonder as our musical advisor, we created Kurzweil Music. In '84, we introduced the Kurzweil 250, which has been recognized as the first electronic musical instrument that could realistically recreate the grand piano and other acoustic instruments, because we really modeled the ability of those instruments to create sounds.
Cary, North Carolina.
Hi. This is a great program. I'm very interested in the concept of calendar reform, and I wonder if Mr. Kurzweil has studied that. We use a very antiquated model of calendar. On the internet, there are many very good scientific proposals to replace it, and the Catholic Church has approved this innovation if it's ever passed by the world. What do you think?
Well, we are actually stuck with a lot of antiquated ideas, like the layout of typewriter keys, the QWERTY keyboard. That was actually designed to prevent keys from interlocking because of the specific limitations of mechanical typewriters, not because it's an efficient way to type, and there's been lots of proposals to change that. These ideas gather momentum. I mean, that's why certain companies or technical standards continue, because people learn how to use them, and then it's very hard to change those things. So,
what does he mean by calendar reform?
I think he's talking about like January and February, that February has 28 days except when it doesn't, and is that what you mean?
He's no longer with us.
I assume that's what he means. So we have certain traditions for measuring things or for laying out information, like on a typewriter keyboard, that go back and are based on realities that are no longer with us, but we're stuck with those traditions, and it's very hard to change those traditions. But we have technology that can keep track of our calendar pretty well, and we're used to it, so I don't see it changing very quickly.
Baltimore, Maryland, go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Kurzweil. My name is Daryl Nazareth, and I'm a physicist doing research in radiation oncology. I'm a fan of yours, and I look at your website every day. Now, my question is, when I talk to people about the upcoming technological revolution, then they typically have the same question, which is, if machines are going to perform more and more human tasks, then won't that result in massive human unemployment? So my thoughts are that as the need for human labor goes down, then the cost of living will also decrease, and therefore humans won't need to work as hard in order to maintain a high standard of living. So I'd like to know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, suppose we were sitting here 100 years ago, let's say around 1900, and let's say I were a prescient futurist, and I told you, well, today 30% of the population work in factories and 30% work on farms. But I predict that within a century, around the year 2000, that figure will be 3% in factories and 3% on farms. And the casual observer would say, my God, it's going to lead to massive unemployment. And I probably wouldn't be able to say, well, don't worry, they'll get jobs as web designers and internet technicians, because we didn't understand those professions. In fact, most jobs today didn't exist. Those job categories didn't exist 100 years ago. We actually have a higher percentage of the population working today. There's about 30% of the population working in 1870. That figure has gone up to about 50%, and jobs pay 6 times as much in constant dollars as they did 120 years ago. So what has happened? We've been eliminating jobs at the bottom of the skill ladder, both physical and mental, and creating new jobs at the top of the skill ladder. So the skill ladder has moved up, and in fact, a lot of the new employment's in education. We had 50,000 college students in 1870. There's 6 or 7 million today. We spend far more per capita in constant dollars on K through 12 education to provide this higher level of skills. And that process is going to continue. And we're actually going to make ourselves smarter. Now, you could say we're doing that already. In fact, if we didn't have this sort of mind amplifier in terms of our technology and search engines and the internet, most people couldn't do their jobs today. So we're very much already extending our intellectual reach with our technology, which enables us to keep up with this ever higher skill ladder. And we're going to literally make ourselves smarter as these machines, move from our pockets into our clothing, into our bodies and brains, and actually extend human intellectual reach further.
We have an emailer who asked, and he asked that, I embrace the progress of technology wholeheartedly, but at some point, don't we run the risk of technology becoming too human and realizing that they are modern slaves and face a possible revolt?
Well, he brings up an interesting issue regarding the legal rights of machines. And nobody worries about that much today. But it's not going to be a clear distinction between human and machine as we get to the 2030s and 2040s. In fact, even a biological human that was born in the ordinary course will have their brains enhanced with non-biological intelligence, and ultimately that non-biological component or portion of our intelligence will be far more capable than the biological portion. And so, is that a machine or is that a human? We'll have machines where there's no biological component, but they're very precise copies of biological people, and they're going to act in exactly the same way. It's going to be all mixed up. You're not going to be able to walk in the room and say, okay, humans on the left side of the room, machines on the right. It's going to be very much an integration of biological and non-biological intelligence, just as it is today, except that the non-biological portion is going to get a lot more capable. And ultimately, they're going to press for their own legal rights. And there's already a lot of interesting discussion about that. And I think that will happen, particularly when you can have an entity that's completely non-biological that's just as convincing in terms of their sophistication and complexity of their emotions as humans. And emotional intelligence is not some little sideshow to our intelligence. It's actually the cutting edge. Because in terms of the logical, analytical things we do, machines can already do a pretty good job of that. Very few mathematicians could hold up to, let's say, Mathematica. And recently, mathematical theorems have been done as a collaboration between the human mathematician and the machine. But emotion is actually the most complicated and sophisticated thing we do. But ultimately, we will understand that as well. And these future machines will have emotional intelligence.
One of the arguments or things you bring out in your books are the fact that the ability for a brain to be downloaded into a synthetic body or a version 2 body, as you call it. What do you mean by that?
Well, as I mentioned, we're going to be merging with non-biological intelligence. We'll have nanobots go inside our bodies and brains, and ultimately we'll have billions of nanobots and other ways in which we're going to be in very direct touch with non-biological intelligence. So then my intelligence is a combination of both my biological intelligence, all the ion channels and neurotransmitters in my brain, and all of this non-biological machine intelligence. Now, the machine part of the intelligence we can clearly download the contents of that easily. We do that all the time with our machines. Machines can share their knowledge, their states at electronic speeds, which is actually 1 million times faster than human brains can share knowledge. But ultimately, we'll be able to tap into the biological patterns as well. We'll be able to have these nanobots scan the state of our ion channels, neurotransmitter concentrations, interneuronal connection patterns, and extract that information. But principally, I don't see that as the real quintessential scenario. I see us becoming essentially more and more non-biological. And that non-biological intelligence can download knowledge and skills, as we saw in the Matrix. We do that all the time with our computers. I mean, we spent years training one research computer to understand human speech. We trained it like a child. We patiently corrected its errors. We exposed it to thousands of hours of speech. And over years, it did a better and better job. And finally, it was commercially viable. Now, if you want your computer to understand human speech, you don't have to go through those years of training like we do have to do with every human child. You can just load the evolved patterns of this one research computer that learned its lessons. It's called loading the software. Machines can take their learning, their skills, and share them at electronic speeds, which is 1 million times faster than we can share our knowledge with language, although the fact that we can share it at all gives us a leg up on other species.
When you consider the future of how man and machine will be together and the ethical dilemmas, where does the government come in? Because do you see more oversight for these technologies as they progress?
Well, it's a complex issue. Sometimes people say, well, look at the stem cell issue, and isn't the government going to stop progress in, for example, biotechnology? But we actually see that issues like that, and stem cells is a good example, are really just a stone in the river. The progress flows around it, and even within stem cells, there's very active stem cell research. I mean, I support stem cell research. I don't think we should have restrictions on it, but even with the restrictions, the real holy grail of stem cell therapies, which is be able to take my own skin cells and create a stem cell that's pluripotent, is making substantial progress. And it's certainly not slowing down work in biotechnology. But there is actually a role for government in containing the dangers of these technologies, because we haven't really touched on that yet. But these technologies is a double-edged sword. And you don't have to look very far to see that. In the 20th century, there were 180 million people killed in wars. Wars weren't necessarily created by technology, but certainly the destructive impact was exacerbated. And we see now we have this asymmetric warfare where an individual can be empowered to be destructive. And the quintessential threat we face right now is in biotechnology. Now, on the one hand, biotechnology is empowering us to reprogram biology to overcome disease like cancer and heart disease. And there's already in the pipeline very dramatic new tools, new drugs that really reprogram biology away from disease, positive things. But it could also empower a bioterrorist to reprogram a biological virus to be more deadly or more communicable or more stealthy. And the tools to do that and the knowledge to do that is pretty widespread. And so how do we deal with that? Well, some people say, well, let's just not go down this path. It's too dangerous. Let's relinquish the whole field. That's a bad idea for three reasons. Number one, it would deprive us of these profound benefits like overcoming suffering and eliminating disease and so on. Secondly, it would require a totalitarian government. I mean, that was the moral in Brave New World. And thirdly, it wouldn't work. It would just drive these technologies underground where they'd be less stable. And the responsible scientists who are trying to defend us from these dangers wouldn't have easy access to the tools to do that. And that's really the moral, that is really the strategy that we need to follow, which is to develop these defenses. And the good news is we actually have the tools and the knowledge to create defenses against, for example, new biological viruses. RNA interference, which I mentioned earlier, can turn genes off. Well, viruses are genes, and RNA interference can turn off viruses. And I proposed, in fact, Bill Joy and I had an op-ed piece in the New York Times a while back calling for a Manhattan-style project to create a rapid response system that could, in a week, sequence a new virus, and that's accelerating. It took us 5 years to sequence HIV, 31 days for SARS. We can sequence a virus now in 1 or 2 days, develop an RNAi medication, and gear up manufacturing. You can do that very quickly. And that's really the strategy we need to deploy. And I'll give you an example where we've actually done that. And we have a new danger, which emerged 30 years ago, the software virus. And they've actually become very sophisticated and actually quite dangerous because we have a lot of important systems that run on computers, like 9/11 response systems, and we fly airplanes by software. And we've actually contained this danger quite well. If a new software virus is identified, it is reverse engineered, an antidote is created, spread virally on the internet, and in 24 hours, we have an automatic response to a new software virus. And nobody has taken the internet down, or even a portion of it, for even a second in 10 years. It's been a very successful track record. Now, it's not, our software protection is not perfect by any means, but that's really the model we need to follow to develop a rapid response system to combat these particular dangers. And that's where the government comes in terms of enforcing certain ethical guidelines. For example, we shouldn't put particularly dangerous information on the web. Like you wouldn't want to put the design of, let's say, the 1918 flu virus on the web because that's dangerous information. But actually the US government has done that, exactly that. You can download the design of the 1918 flu virus from the US government's website. And Bill Joy and I, in this op-ed piece, criticized that. So that's a role. I mean, in fact, just recently there was some information how to build an atomic bomb from these Iraqi papers on the web. And everybody, and that was inadvertent, I guess, and everyone agreed that was not a good idea. There's no controversy about that. But so for some reason in the biological realm, there's controversy about it because this dangerous information is still up there. So we need to actually have some guidelines to prevent clearly dangerous information from being widely disseminated. Some people do need that information. They could be given the information in confidence with classified, agreements and so on.
Jacksonville, Florida.
Hi, Ray. Thanks for being on C-SPAN. I really enjoy your show here. My question deals with technology and behavior. I would define physical as technological versus behavioral being emotional. Let me give you a quick example. All the cars here in Jacksonville seem to be equipped with turn signals, which are technological, yet only 1 in 3 people seem to use them, which to me is behavioral. They have the technology, but they don't behave with the technology. We pass laws, give them driving tests, pretty much do everything we do, and yet can't get people to behave with the technology. Now, you've had a good lead into my question here, speaking about destructive technology, which is to say technology is a two-edged sword, can be used for good or bad. My question for you is, when you've got 6 billion people on the planet, or 6.5 billion people on a planet, that already have this ability to do what these machines are going to be able to do that you're talking about, and yet all these people, or the vast majority of them, don't seem to be behaving as well with the technology that the boss Truth Almighty's already given them, kind of like 1 in 3 or 2 out of 3 drivers in Jacksonville not using their turn signal. Where do you see that this technology is going? I don't quite understand how this technology is going to be that boom to humanity when we already don't behave with the technology that we're given. Which, let me put it in these terms. We're not being, it doesn't seem we're being faithful with the little bit that we're already being given, so why are we going to be any more faithful with even more developing it from a technological standpoint?
Caller, thank you.
Well, it's a good question, and actually to reinforce your question, I'll give you another example, which is people don't take advantage of all the health knowledge we have. There's actually a lot of knowledge we have already to dramatically reduce the likelihood of disease. You can reduce your likelihood of getting cancer or heart disease or diabetes by more than 90%. We can slow down the aging process. And many people, I'd say most people, don't take full advantage of this knowledge. Some people are health conscious, but even people who consider themselves health conscious don't take advantage of all the knowledge that is out there. The thrust, though, of the technology is to make this easier and actually overcome this tendency that you articulated quite well of humans not to take advantage of all the knowledge in their vicinity. I mean, we know that you shouldn't tailgate, but most people do that, and we should take care of ourselves, and a lot of people don't do that. These future technologies will take that into account. I mean, for example, in the case of cars, which you mentioned, there are collision avoidance systems that are going to actually take over the car if it senses that you're getting too close to another vehicle, and maybe not perfectly prevent accidents, but substantially reduce them, even if you're not doing all the things that you should do as a safe driver. Similarly, in health, while there's a lot that you should do to stay healthy, we're going to have drugs that actually turn off atherosclerosis. I mean, Pfizer's torcetrapib, which is going through the approval mechanism, turns off one enzyme that destroys HDL in the blood. By inhibiting that enzyme, HDL levels soar, and the phase 2 trial showed that this dramatically reduced atherosclerosis, and Pfizer is spending a record $1 billion on the phase 3 trials. That will actually, if it meets its promise, and if not that drug, there'll be many others, will actually compensate for bad behavior and keep people healthy and reverse atherosclerosis. So at least eventually we'll be able to actually do that, overcome cancer, even if people are not taking the steps to prevent cancer. So these technologies ultimately will step in to compensate for sort of, the inability of humans to, be perfect in their behavior.
Our guest has also written a few books on dealing with health issues. This is the 10% Solution for a Healthy Life and Fantastic Voyage, the Science Behind Radical Life Extension. Why are you interested in this topic?
It used to be a separate interest. I had this interest being an inventor, principally with information technology and pattern recognition, as we discussed. And I had this separate interest in health. It started with the untimely death of my father when I was 22. He was 58. I'm actually 58 now. And then in my mid-30s, I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and tried the conventional approach. It actually made things worse. So I wrote the 10% Solution, which was a successful health book, really sharing the program I developed that overcame my own diabetes, and I've had no type 2 diabetes for the last 20 years.
What kind of program was that?
Basically nutrition, exercise, some supplements, but mostly lifestyle and natural means, although there's some good drugs, like metformin, I believe is actually an anti-aging drug, but also combats type 2 diabetes. Then I confronted another health challenge, which was middle age, and actually been addressing the aging process and do a lot to slow down aging, and I believe we can do that. According to biological aging tests, I was about 38 biologically when I was 40, and according to these tests, I'm come out at 40 even though I'm 58. And these tests, there's controversy about them as to whether they're perfect. I think they're just, one piece of information, but in terms of the way I feel that I have slowed down the aging process. And there's really a lot of knowledge to do that. And this latest book, which came out 2 years ago, which I co-authored with Dr. Terry Grossman, a leading longevity expert in Denver, articulates 3 bridges to radical life extension. And it's really a wake-up call for baby boomers, because bridge 1 is what you can do right now to slow down the aging process and disease process, so that, and that by itself will not enable us to live hundreds of years. That will just keep us in good shape for another 10, 15, 20 years until we get to bridge 2. And bridge 2 is the full flowering of this biotechnology revolution we've been talking about, which is proceeding exponentially, because we're doubling the amount of genetic data we sequence each year and the amount of proteomic data, and all these different aspects of biology are progressing exponentially. In 15 years from now, it's going to be a very different world where we can really reprogram the information processes underlying biology, and they fundamentally are information processes, and we're getting the tools to reprogram our bodies just like we reprogram our computers. And that will bring us to the third revolution, say 25 years from now, the nanotechnology revolution, the nanobots we talked about earlier, which can go inside our bodies and keep us healthy from inside. I mentioned there's already very interesting experiments along those lines in animals, but 25 years from now, we'll have very powerful nanobots that can go inside our bodies and keep us healthy at the cellular level. So it's a bridge to a bridge to a bridge. And you can get on bridge 1 now and therefore be healthy and in good shape when bridge 2 comes around. That'll keep us to bridge 3. So even baby boomers, people in their 50s, 60s, and even 70s, and if you're really diligent, 80s, can stay in good shape for another 10 years, 15 years, when it's really will be a different world. That's why the subtitle is Live Long Enough to Live Forever. Now, I mentioned these have been 2 separate interests, and I got interested in this because of my own health challenges and having had the experience with my father, and realizing that as an inventor, I can find the ideas to overcome challenges, even if they're outside of my computer interest. But actually now, these 2 areas have merged. They're now the same field, because biology, medicine, health is undergoing a grand transformation from what used to not be an information technology. It was hit or miss. We just find something. Or here's something lowers blood pressure. We don't know why this works. To where biology and medicine is becoming an information technology, where we can actually understand it as information processes and reprogram those information processes. And the exciting thing about that is now that we can do that, we can actually, it's actually subject to this law of accelerating returns, this doubling of the power of these technologies every year. That didn't used to be the case before medicine was an information technology. But now that it is, it's subject to this inherent acceleration.
San Francisco, California. We've had Sherwin Newland on this program, and when he talks about what you're talking about as far as extension of life and things, he was quoted as saying this. He says, people like Ray Kurzweil have forgotten they're acting on the basic biological fear of death and extinction, and it distorts their rational approach to the human condition. Are you afraid of death?
I think we should be. I think death is a great tragedy, and I think that's a very common view. We really haven't had much we could do about death and aging up until recently. So the response of the human civilization has been to rationalize, oh, death, which is obviously a tragedy. It's a profound loss of knowledge and skill and personality and relationships and love and all kinds of things. Oh, that's really a good thing. That's really ennobling. in some abstract sense. Not that these people actually want to die. In fact, people don't want to die unless they're in some profound pain, is what we have found. But we've rationalized it as a good thing, and a lot of our philosophies and religions have been geared towards that. And in my view, what's ennobling of this, grand human project is the expansion of knowledge, and not as dusty information, but as music and art and all the things that enrich our lives, relationships, and all of that is robbed by disease, by aging, by death, and we're gaining the tools to overcome that. It'll be a very different world. According to my models, in 15 years, we'll be adding more than a year every year to your remaining life expectancy, not just infant life expectancy. And so as you go forward, life expectancy will move on away from you. That's not a guarantee, but that does give us the ability then to live forever or live indefinitely. Because people say, well, these changes, how many more years will it provide us? Well, a particular change may add 5 years or 10 years, but then you go another 5, 10 years, and there's more changes that come. And you get to a point where there's a positive slope to the equation, and as you go forward in time, there's more progress that enables you to go even further. And I think that's a positive thing. I think death is a great robber of what's meaningful to us. But this philosophy that death is a noble thing and that death gives meaning to life and death is the purpose of life is a very deeply rooted philosophy that really had no choice but to adopt because we had no alternative.
Do you think it's an underlying drive of what you do? The reason you created technology, the reason you think about the technology and the future of it and life extension?
Well, life extension is one interest. I mean, I started this forecasting of technology trends for a practical reason, because I realized that timing was key to being successful as an inventor. And most inventions, or most inventors fail, not because they can't get the thing to work, but because the timing is wrong and the market isn't ready, that not all the enabling factors are in place when they need to be. And realizing that 30 years ago, I began as an engineer to collect a lot of data and build mathematical models, and I saw they were tracking quite accurately, and I developed this whole theory. And I'm not just saying this now looking backwards and overfitting to past data. I've been making these forward-looking predictions for a long time. And I use this actually to time my inventions, this pocket-sized reading machine for the blind. I had a conversation with the National Federation of the Blind 4 years ago and projected that this would be feasible in 4 years and would take 4 years to develop, and therefore we should get started back then, whereas other companies are starting now because they realize it's feasible. So anticipating where technology will be is important to being successful as an inventor. But it does enable us to look out 10 years or 20 years and see what the world will be like. And what I see is actually quite attractive. We'll be able to greatly expand our appreciation and creation of knowledge and overcome profound problems. And it's a future I want to see. So that actually motivates me to want to stay in good shape to get there. So I'm not just interested in hanging on. I'm not just interested in radical life extension. I'm also interested in radical life expansion as we continue to expand our physical and mental capabilities by enhancing them with our creations.
Before we leave this, about your program you talked about, I read about the number of supplements you take on a daily basis. How many are those?
It's running right now about 250. And that's the current state of the technology. I mean, I'm really reprogramming my biochemistry, and I'm not flying without an instrument panel. I mean, I take 50, 60 different blood tests periodically to see, aside from just things like cholesterol and homocysteine and triglycerides, I mean, I measure a lot of different things and constantly adjusting the program. But, according to every possible way we can measure these things, I'm staying quite healthy and not aging significantly in all these different ways, hormone levels and nutrient levels and so on. But we have to be aggressive today to reprogram our biochemistry. This is the state of the art right now. I mean, we weren't evolved to live at our ages. I mean, human life expectancy was 25 1,000 years ago. It was not in the interest of the species for people to live past child rearing, and that meant like age 25. As I mentioned, it was 37 in 1800. So we really need to reprogram our biochemistry to slow down and turn off these aging disease processes. And this is the way we can do it today. It's an individualized program. You see what your issues are and how aggressive you want to be and how many different types of body systems you want to enhance and keep at peak performance. And so I'm trying to do that for myself. It will get easier. 15 years from now, we really will have much more powerful drugs that can reprogram biology at a fundamental level. And so relatively easily, we'll be able to slow down these aging and disease processes. But Bridge 1, if you want to apply it aggressively, is not a one-trick pony.
First, Ray Kurzweil, San Diego.
Yes, I have a traumatic brain injury that severely affects short-term memory and frontal lobe executive functions, which speak to your pattern recognition. And I had a thought. I agree. I sort of ennoble the rationalization that it's character building for me to learn from suffering. And I've personally gotten over suffering from. But I thought with your work with Stevie Wonder, and I look at movies like Forrest Gump and Rain Man, where the people around the supposedly disabled person are transformed out of their relationship with someone. And like with stem cells and stuff, you can see the temptation for genetic engineering to eliminate abnormalities out of society. And I wonder, is it a total rationalization that something we call being human would be lost if we use nanotechnology and that stuff to perfect humans and to eliminate all suffering?
Caller, thanks.
Well, I think you make a very good point at distinguishing between a defect and a quote abnormality that might really be a different way of relating to the world that is profound and creative in its own way. And we do find, for example, in autism that people have limitations in certain types of communication, but these individuals can pursue knowledge and have skills that other people can't have and are really relating to the world in a different way. I agree that there are different ways to relate to the world, and we're not all the same. And, you know, there's no such thing as normal human behavior. What's normal human musical ability? Was it the guy in my hotel room this morning who was whistling a song, or is it Beethoven or the Beatles? There's a broad range, and as we get to the higher ranges of human capability, they become quite unique and perhaps iconoclastic, as you point out. I actually think as we enhance our minds by getting closer to our technology, we're not going to become all the same. We're going to actually become more different. We're actually fairly similar today. There's less genetic diversity among all humans than in one troop of baboons. We all have a brain that's organized the same way with the same regions and the same kinds of basic architecture, and it's constrained by a skull. And we can change our brain in certain ways, a certain amount of plasticity, but there's limitations on how far we can go with it. When we can actually break out of our skulls conceptually by enhancing our thinking beyond 100 billion slow neurons, we'll actually be able to pursue different ways of thinking, different ways of creating that are very unique. And someone could really pursue, you know, profound new forms of music in ways that wouldn't be feasible before, and someone else might, you know, pursue history and get new insights that would be impossible today because they could master a lot more knowledge. And we'll actually become more different, and I think that actually would be a good thing.
An emailer asks, if our technology keeps advancing, isn't the real problem in distributing it effectively and making it cost reasonable?
Okay, another good question. And one implication of the law of accelerating returns is a 50% deflation rate. And you can see that clearly in electronics. You can get the same capability for half the money a year later. And generally technology, particularly the kinds of technology that individuals use, follow a certain path. And when it comes out, it's unaffordable. Only the wealthy can afford it. But at that point, it actually doesn't work very well. And a few years later, it works a little bit, and it's merely expensive. And then it becomes inexpensive and actually is perfected and has a lot of new features and is very capable. And then ultimately, it's almost free and is very ubiquitous. And you can see that with the cell phone. Take societies in Asia where 15 years ago they had primitive agrarian economies and most people were pushing a plow, and today they have thriving information economies. That lag from early adoption of extremely expensive technologies to a version that's very inexpensive and very ubiquitous and very almost free is 10 years. But that's going to accelerate. There's a paradigm shift rate that doubles every decade. So 10 years from now, that'll be a 5-year lag. And 20 years from now, that'll be a 2 or 3 year lag. So these technologies ultimately become very ubiquitous. When we have full-scale nanotechnology, molecular nanotechnology assembly, and tabletop replicators that can use massively parallel information processes to create macro objects, but building them at the molecular level by reorganizing very inexpensive input materials, we'll be able to create, really from just information and very inexpensive input materials, most of the things we need, from clothing and food to computers. And basically information will be the only thing that has value. We're moving gradually to where the information component of the value of products and services is asymptoting to 100%. So the point is that these technologies ultimately become very widespread. I mean, think back 15 years ago, someone took out a mobile phone in a movie. That was your signal from the director that this was a very important person, because only the wealthy and powerful could have a mobile phone. And they didn't work very well. And you don't have to be a powerful person now to have a mobile phone. Consider making intellectual creations. You used to have to be a big Hollywood studio to create a movie. Well, now with your $500 camera and your PC, you can actually create a full quality Hollywood motion picture, and successful motion pictures have been done that way. Or a recorded album. You don't have to be a big recording label. Or a couple of kids at Stanford, they were just with their $1,000 PCs wrote a piece of software. Today it's worth $100 billion, and you use it to search the internet. So the tools of creativity are now very widespread. They cost hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars, not millions of dollars. You don't have to be a big organization to make these intellectual creations anymore.
Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, Doctor, a few years back I asked you on a radio show whether there was a device that you could hook up to a synthesizer and where you could whistle or hum or a melody and have that device transfer to the synthesizer and have it play it out through the synthesizer. And you put me onto a device called a pitch tracker. Now I wonder, this was a few years back, I wonder, is there anything out there that's maybe beyond the pitch tracker that you're aware of, or is the pitch tracker still the way to go?
Well, a pitch tracker is the way to go if you're trying to do what you describe, of turning your own voice and singing into another type of instrument. Although that'll just track the pitch. In this little clip that was played about 45 minutes ago of my Ramona project, we transferred my voice into another voice, into Ramona's voice. And that was more than just changing the pitch, because a woman's voice has completely different characteristics. And if you just change the pitch, it would have the Munchkin effect. It'd sound like a little chipmunk and not like a woman. So that actually was more complex, of breaking that down into its components and changing each one of the components separately. And that gets into multi-pitch trackers where, let's say somebody's playing a piano or a guitar, which has many notes at the same time, being able to track all of those at the same time. And that's a more complicated problem, and they're making advances on that. Hyundai, the big Korean car company, just bought Kurzweil Music Systems, and I'll be working with them on a new generation of musical instruments that will use some new advanced synthesis techniques so that we can create, if we want to just recreate the piano or the violin or orchestral instruments, we can do that, but that's already well established. But we'll be able to create instruments that are just as satisfying and complex and rich and deep as these acoustic instruments, but that have but are things that we've never heard before. So there's many different ways in which we can use our understanding of the psychology of music and our pattern recognition as applied to musical sound to create a whole new world of very musically satisfying sounds and sound responses but that are synthetic and things that we've never heard before.
An emailer asks, who are your favorite songwriters and composers, and what do you consider the best piece of music ever written?
Well, my favorite classical composer is Beethoven. Actually, if you listen to his late sonatas, like the 31st and 32nd Sonata, which is well past the point when he was deaf, they're very jazzy. And they really remind me of contemporary jazz. They're not played that often, but I suggest people listen to them. So he really went off in his mind in a very futuristic way and anticipated a lot of trends in music. It really has a modern 20th century Afro-American sound to it. It's pretty remarkable. Contemporary music, the groups that are still popular were popular when I was a college student, so these 60s groups like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones are still quite remarkable. The Rolling Stones are remarkable because they've stayed together for 40 years. The Beatles are interesting in that, usually creativity is one person, maybe there's other people supporting them, but here you actually have a group that was brilliant as a foursome, and not even a twosome, but a foursome. And all those individuals, when they went off on their own, made interesting music, but nothing like the brilliance of that collaboration. So there's a lot about creativity we don't yet understand, particularly when you have a collaborative process where it wasn't just one person's brilliance that created the music. I also like female artists like Alanis Morissette. That's why I wanted to be a successful female singer, and I do plan for Ramona to continue her career.
How do you see, as the future of man and machine progresses, how we entertain ourselves?
Well, actually, computer games has been a cutting edge of computer technology. In fact, game machines are actually more powerful than PCs, and they're little supercomputers in their own right. And we are creating virtual reality in these game worlds, and ultimately they will put us in a full immersion three-dimensional world. They're getting very realistic, but they're still on this two-dimensional screen with defined edges. Eventually they'll actually take over our whole visual field of view. That's actually feasible. One of the reasons, and one of the things they're struggling with, because I've talked to some people in the game industry, is the liability issue. You've got a 10-year-old kid who's lost in a virtual world and is in this three-dimensional world that's in the game, is going to lose track of real reality and is going to be knocking down lamps and starting fires. And so exactly how to deal with that is something that's under discussion. But the technology is actually becoming available to do that.
Our next call from Detroit, Michigan. Detroit, go ahead, please.
Hello, thank you, C-SPAN, and thank you, Mr. Kurzweil, for your obvious contributions. I have a question in regard to the virtual reality and whether or not you see a capability for perhaps some sort of 3D projection via satellite without to necessarily have a hardware set. There could be a function for diplomacy or just for people to express ideas in that function, whether it would be a one-way dictation or even potentially some way of having a two-way conversation.
Well, I think the internet is becoming our global nervous system and communication backbone. It does allow virtual worlds. You already have things like Second Life and so on, where you can enter a virtual reality world with other people. And you might say, well, if Second Life isn't as realistic as real reality, that's true today. But I mean, look at how video games went from, Pong, which was a very unrealistic representation of ping pong or tennis, to the very highly realistic, animations and virtual reality you have now in games, and that will take the leap to full immersion, three-dimensional virtual reality. So these virtual reality environments that exist on our computers, empowered by the internet, where we can communicate with anyone, is ultimately going to become full immersion virtual reality. We don't actually have to go inside the nervous system to do that. We can have images written directly to our retina from our eyeglasses. The systems will detect our head motion and will actually put us into a full immersion virtual reality environment. This technology already exists. It's expensive today, but it will be ubiquitous and inexpensive in the future. And so then even if you and I, being hundreds of miles apart, we could enter a virtual reality environment and it would seem just like we're there. We can look around each other, at least visually and auditorily, which is how most of our meetings are conducted. We can be in a virtual reality environment. So if you want to have a diplomatic conversation, we could create a virtual hall of Versailles and have a meeting just like we're together. And of course, we use the current state of the technology to create virtual communication all the time. This will be very realistic. You've got 10 years. This is how most meetings will take place. The whole technology of buildings, classrooms, lecture halls, cities is really for aggregating people so we can get together and communicate. We're going to be increasingly doing that in virtual environments as these virtual environments get more and more realistic, to the point where they're indistinguishable from real reality. And when we can go inside the nervous system and do that from inside the nervous system, it will also include the tactile and other senses, and it'll really be just like being together.
We have one more hour with our guest, Ray Kurzweil. As we go to break, we're going to look at one of the machines that he has developed, especially one that helps them, or helps blind people, helps them to read. We'll see that, and then we'll come right back.
So this is actually the original Kurzweil reading machine, and it was actually the first CCD flatbed scanner. The imaging device can only see about an inch, so it actually scans each line individually. But this was the first scanner, flatbed scanner, which is now ubiquitous. And I developed the first omnified character recognition, the first character recognition that could recognize any type style. And that was sort of a solution in search of a problem. And I happened to sit next to a blind guy on a plane who said, gee, he can do anything, he's quite independent, but he can't read ordinary printed material. So that really, from that point on, I devoted the character recognition software to the blind reading problem. And we developed the scanner. We actually developed the first full text-to-speech synthesis. Those are three distinct technologies, and we put them together in the first print-to-speech reading machine. And this is from the 70s. It came out in 1976. But you can see it's the size of a dishwasher. And it's looking for the first page of print.
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure.
When this came out, character recognition at that time could only deal in a single type style. It had to be unit-spaced. Letters could not touch one another. It couldn't deal with any kind of printing errors. The people actually retyped documents using a special type ball with the selector typewriter before they would scan them in using character recognition. So this was the first really intelligent character recognition. And a version of this was actually used to create these big databases in the 1970s and early 80s, like Lexis and Nexus. So that was a commercial application. But this was the first print-to-speech reading machine for the blind. And since it was expensive and large, it was used in institutions like libraries and schools. And over the years, it's come down in size. Up until recently, the Kurzweil 1000 was a small desk-based system, a little scanner with your personal computer, but it was still a desk-based system. You had to bring material back to your desk. And there's a lot of material you can't bring back to your desk, like sign on a wall or a bank ATM display. You could bring a menu back to your desk, but you'd rather read it in the restaurant. Labels in your clothing, remainders at a book sale, handouts at a meeting. So the Holy Grail has always been a device that a blind person can take in their pocket and just take out and read material as they go through the day. So it took 30 years, because this was 1976, and actually this year, 2006, 30 years later, we introduced the first pocket-sized machine. So this is the Kurzweil National Federation of the Blind Reader. We developed it with the National Federation of the Blind. I actually worked with them on the first reading machine in 1976. This is 1,000 times smaller than that first reading machine, 1,000 times lighter, and the computer is actually 1,000 times as powerful. So it gives you some idea. That's a 1,000,000-to-1 ratio in terms of the power of computation. A blind person could just hold it up to a wall and it'll tell them where the print is, if it's cutting off the right or left edges.
Field of view report. Right bottom and left edges are visible, 44% filled.
Okay, so it sees most of the edges. We'll take a picture. And it's going to give us progress reports. This page could be rotated any amount. In fact, it deals with 3 different degrees of freedom of tilt and rotation. And so you can really hold the camera any which way, and it'll actually correct the image inside its memory.
0 degrees clockwise relative to the page.
So it said I got it right on,
Processing image.
but I could have rotated it.
Page 1, GNL 289. The AI winter is long since over. We are well into the spring of narrow AI. Most of the examples above were research projects just 10 to 15 years ago. If all the AI systems in the world suddenly stopped functioning, our economic infrastructure would grind to a halt.
Pages can be curved in a book, and the software in here actually straightens out the image, cleans it up, and enhances it, and then does the recognition of the letters, and then figures out the pronunciation. And so all of that's being done in the computer inside this device. It's actually a good example of my models of predicting technology trends, because in 2002, 4 years ago, I had a conversation with the National Federation of the Blind. They said, well, when do you think these portable reading machines will be feasible? And I said, according to our models, the requisite digital camera and pocket computer technology will be feasible in 4 years, by 2006. And that actually turned out to be exactly correct. And I also felt it would take 4 years to develop the software. So we started 2002, and the software got done, the hardware became available right on schedule, and we introduced this in 2006. Other people are now waking up to the fact, oh, the cameras and pocket computers are powerful enough to do this, and they're starting the research now. It's going to take them a few years to develop the software. So we have a jump on the market because of our ability to predict where technology will be in the future. And this is something I've been doing for 30 years, and my books are based on the same technology models. So we can forecast where technology will be in 4 years, or 10 years, or 20 years.
Here are the 10 best-selling hardcover nonfiction books from the New York Times for the week ending October 21st. For the second week in a row, The Innocent Man tops the list. John Grisham chronicles a convicted man's near execution for murder and his subsequent exoneration. Senator Barack Obama premieres on the list at number 2. His book is The Audacity of Hope. At number 3 is Washington Post reporter Bob Woodward's third book about the Bush administration, State of Denial. Next is Culture Warrior. Bill O'Reilly describes an American culture war defined by religion, race, and other issues. Fifth is a collection of essays on aging by screenwriter Nora Ephron, I Feel Bad About My Neck. In his memoir, The Life and Times of the Thunderbolt Kid, Bill Bryson describes growing up in Des Moines in the 1950s. It premieres on the list this week at number 6. Seventh is John Grogan's tribute to his Labrador retriever, Marley and Me. That's followed by The God Delusion. Evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins argues against the existence of God. Fox News anchor Steve Doocy presents observations on marriage and family life at number 9, The Mr. and Mrs. Happy Handbook. And rounding out the top 10 is I Like You, Amy Sedaris' humorous guide to throwing parties. For more information, visit the New York Times website at nytimes.com.
We are back with our guest, Ray Kurzweil, who has written, amongst many books, The Singularity is Near When Humans Transcend Biology. He has also written The Age of Spiritual Machines. And could you tell us a little about how you write books, what goes into how you do it?
Well, I actually start by writing an essay, what I want to accomplish in the book. And it'll be maybe a chapter-length essay. And then I expand that. Rather than just writing the book from start to finish, I'll expand the essay, developing this part and that part, and develop it into a book. I get feedback from my research group and advisors as to ideas about what should be expanded and questions that should be addressed. I have a research team that gathers data for me, so if I want to cover a certain area, they'll send me books and articles. And on our website, for example, on Singularity.com, we have a list of actually all the books and articles I read to write the book. And then as I write the material, I actually write the citations with it. There's about 2,000 scientific citations in Singularity is Near and also Fantastic Voyage that I co-authored with Terry Grossman, because I'm making claims that run counter to some conventional wisdom, and so they need to be backed up by strong evidence. And then I go through a rewriting process like any other author, of getting feedback from my editor at the publisher and other people. I list all the people that gave me advice, good or bad. I actually like criticism because that's the way to improve something. And finally, when I feel I can't improve it anymore, I ship it out the door. But actually, I never get to that point. At some point, you have to declare it a moment in time, and this is the best I can do for the moment until the next book.
Now, because you have technology that distinguishes human voice, do you dictate books or do you type manually?
Well, actually, I dictated most of the Age of Spiritual Machines, really as an exercise to show use of that technology. I can dictate at 50 or 60 words a minute. That is actually what you can do with speech recognition. I happened to take typing in high school. That was one useful course I took. So I have very good typing skills. I can type 90 or 100 words a minute. So speech recognition actually slows me down, but most people type 15 or 20 words a minute. So speech recognition actually would speed up most people, but I actually type pretty fast. So.
In the Age of Spiritual Machines, in your acknowledgments, you, amongst many, list a gentleman named David High for actually devising a spiritual machine for the cover. What did you mean by that?
Oh, well, there's kind of a holographic image there. And so we were trying to figure out, what would be a symbol for something so abstract as to be a spiritual machine. We don't want to just put a picture of a machine or some conventional high-tech image. So he created this just silver but holographic image that reflects the light in different ways depending on what visual condition you're in. So I thought it was kind of a cool way to symbolize a very abstract notion.
How long does it take you to write a book typically?
Well, Singularity is Near and Fantastic Voyage I really wrote at the same time. The latter co-authored with Terry Grossman, although that didn't save time because we both really poured over every sentence, and we both feel passionately about every idea in there. And if we weren't already 99% on the same page, it would have been impossible. Because it wasn't like, okay, you do this and I'll do that, and we don't really care about the other sections. We really cared about every sentence. We would have 50 emails about one of the citations back and forth. But it came out a much better book because we really, if we had came out initially with a different perspective on an issue, we would run it down and look at all the research until we really had enough in-depth knowledge to come to a better position that we both felt comfortable with. So it's a much better book for that process. But it definitely took as long as either one of writing it ourselves. But I wrote both of these books over a 2-year period.
Tell us about your family.
My wife is a psychologist. She's one of her interests actually is reading, but also just child development, both intellectually and emotionally. We have a lot of interesting discussions because she's understanding human development in the psychological realm, and I'm trying to study the same topic, but to understand it in quantifiable terms so that we can recreate aspects of human intelligence. But she's a wonderful child therapist and has done a number of creative projects in that area. She and my daughter actually wrote a book together, which you're holding. My daughter is an avid dancer, choreographer, a sophomore at Stanford, and writer. And she, my daughter, my wife and my daughter wrote this book, Forever Poems for Now and Then, together. And then my son is a student at Harvard Business School. He went to Stanford also, worked at McKinsey for a few years, and is quite passionate about technology business.
Do they share your beliefs about the future of technology?
I would say yes. My kids definitely have their outlook shaped by this perspective. You commonly run into this very common paradigm of, well, human life is only, 70, and we're going to slow down at 65, and the the sort of common conception of the life cycle of humans. And that, I would say that's not my kids' perspective at all. So that my wife and my kids definitely are immersed in my ideas. My wife is fortunately very healthy, but she's also conscious about her health.
Manhattan Beach, California. Good morning. Good afternoon.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you, C-SPAN, and thank you, Dr. Kurzweil. I have several questions. I'll rattle them off quickly. Do you believe in God, or do you think man is God? And if man is God, what happened before the Big Bang? Or possibly, is man part of God? And beyond that, what do you think of string theory, and what do you think of parallel universes? That'll do it for now.
Okay. Actually, talk about those topics quite a bit in chapters 6 and 7 of my book. 6 on string theory and parallel universes, and chapter 7 on philosophy, spirituality, God, and so on. I mentioned earlier a conception of evolution as a spiritual process. At least that's what we see in evolution. As entities evolve, as they evolve through biological evolution, and we see this now continuing in technological evolution, they become more complicated, more complex, more intelligent, more creative, and actually more beautiful, more capable of expressing higher level emotions. We don't see that, for example, in lower animals. So expressions like love or even being funny and things that are uniquely human are things that happen more and more as entities evolve. And we're going to actually expand that through this expansion of human intelligence with our technology. So through evolution, we're becoming more God-like, never really reaching that ideal, because God is expressed as infinite, all-knowing, infinitely intelligent. Well, we're not going to become infinite. Evolution stays finite, but it explodes exponentially, so it's moving in that direction. That's as close as I can get to this conception. I think, though, that we will saturate the matter and energy in our part of the universe, our solar system. Actually, it won't take that long. It'll take about a century for us to saturate the ability of matter and energy to support computation and communication in our little part of the universe, and then spread out to the rest of the universe. And I see ultimately the universe being transformed into an intelligent civilization that spans a galaxy and multiple galaxies, and ultimately the whole universe. And so the whole universe will wake up. That'll seem pretty godlike from our very limited perspective today. So you could say that the universe will wake up, will become conscious. There will be a God. At least that satisfies my need for a God, to have the entire universe wake up. I'd like to be around to see that. That's one reason I'm interested in Bridge 1 on this road to radical life extension. And this does get to the parallel universes, because you might ask, how did our universe be so bio-friendly? I just wrote a foreword to Jim Gardner's new book, Intelligent Universes, where he spends a whole book addressing this, and I talk about it in chapter 6 of Singularity is Near. If you look at the standard model of physics, there's about 50 different constants and values that are set very precisely to values to allow atoms to exist, and molecules, and therefore stars and planets, and that allowed biological evolution to take place. And if certain constants, the Planck constant and other constants in the standard model of physics, were set just slightly differently, there would have been no evolution and no biology and no intelligence. So how did that happen? Well, that's an interesting question. Now, some people say, well, it's an intelligent design. There must have been an intelligent designer. That may be the case. The intelligent designer, though, could be an intelligent entity in some other universe. String theory does allow multiple universes, because there are multiple solutions to the formulas of string theory that does allow for multiple universes, each actually with different laws of physics. And it may have been an evolutionary process that the universes get better and better designed as one universe begets another. And it could have been a natural evolutionary process, or it could actually be an intelligent entity, some evolved intelligence in another universe, actually creates, using some very advanced technology, a new universe, and perhaps it created our universe. I speculated in the foreword to this book that maybe our universe is a junior high school science experiment some adolescent superintelligence in another universe. But we are left with the fact that our universe has a set of physical laws which are remarkably fine-tuned to allow this evolution of complexity that we saw in biological and technological evolution.
We have an emailer who asks, could you speak to the political and religious anti-reactions to science?
Well, there is this accelerating pace of change. I mean, I mentioned that information technology is growing exponentially, doubling in its power every year. The paradigm shift rate, the rate of progress, is also accelerating, basically doubling every decade. And you can really feel that now. I mean, you go back 5 years and there was no social networks, no blogs, no podcasts. People were just starting to use search engines. That sounds like ancient history, and that's only 5 years ago. And so things are happening faster and faster. And by the way, that's not intuitive. When I gave a presentation at Time Magazine's Future of Life conference on the 50th anniversary of the discovery of structure of DNA, all of us speakers were asked, what will the next 50 years bring? And all the speakers there, except actually for Bill Joy and myself, use the last 50 years as a model for the next 50 years. But that's not accurate, because we'll see 32 times more progress in the next 50 years because of this acceleration. And this backlash, actually, I think, is from the increased anxiety that this accelerating pace of change fosters. I think this rise of fundamentalism is a reaction to this accelerating pace of change. And it is a fundamentally a fundamental problem because of the increasing potential for asymmetric warfare, this empowerment of the individual, which can empower an individual to be creative. So one kid at Stanford can create something that's worth billions of dollars, and a couple of kids can create a movie that rivals Hollywood studios. A bioterrorist can also create a very dangerous bioweapon with these same tools and same knowledge. And if you have a rise of fundamentalism defining humans the way they were in the 7th century, the 3rd century, 13th century, and having a violent reaction to trying to continue the advance of progress, combined with these potential for asymmetric warfare, that's a serious challenge. And I think that's actually the fundamental, the primary challenge that we face as we go forward.
What do you think about the president's approach to science funding?
Well, I mean, I said before that I support unrestricted pursuit of stem cell research, and I think that's very unfortunate that we have these restrictions. I don't think, however, it's having a huge effect, because stem cell research is progressing quite rapidly. And in fact, what we really want to do is take my skin cells and turn them into pluripotent cells that can create any organ or type of cell with my own DNA. It's called transdifferentiation. It's really the holy grail of cell engineering. These oppositions tend to be stones in the river, but they're unfortunate stones, and it does slow certain things down, which I think overall science funding has not gone down. I mean, if you look at the statistics, funding of science through the government and through the corporate sector has continued its historical growth rates. We don't, and it is doing remarkable things, but it's not really a policy of a Democratic or Republican administration. I mean, it has kind of a life of its own. And when I was at National Institutes of Health a few weeks ago and sharing ideas with the directors and the chief scientists, there's some very remarkable things happening now that we have these increasingly powerful tools, remarkable databases, very powerful tools to be able to reverse engineer genes and see their impact as proteins, and be able to relate gene states to disease states with this Million Genome Project that's coming, and many other things. So I'm not dissatisfied overall with science funding. I think we should keep politics out of it. However, I'm not alarmed that it's significantly distorting progress. And progress isn't just from the government. I mean, we have many billions of dollars of corporate funding. And we get from here to there not with some grand leap to, let's say, create human-level intelligence. We get there actually 100 steps, through 100 steps. Each one is small, market-driven. the market wants a little bit more intelligent search engine, a more flexible operating system, and all these little steps, if you add them all up and they get to be faster and faster, end up getting us to very remarkable places in fairly short order.
Idaho Falls, Idaho. Go ahead.
Cartoon shown a couple segments ago about the brain in the tank was presaged by John Hersey's book, The Child Buyer, back in the 60s sometime. If you're familiar with that book, I'd like you to comment about it. And I'd like you also to comment about the chances of the folks who want to bring back the 8th century of actually succeeding. And I chose the 8th century because the Battle of Tours was actually a pretty close-run thing. And I'd like to listen on the air, if you please. Thank you very much.
I actually missed the beginning of your question, but I'll comment on the 8th century. I don't think fundamentalist views, particularly ones that want to turn the clock back, are likely to succeed. Our belief in progress, in technology, in finding solutions to problems is pretty deeply rooted, and the world has actually moved very much in this direction. If you go back 50 years ago, there actually weren't that many democracies. There weren't that many countries that practiced free enterprise. And so we've actually moved quite a bit, even though there are notable holdouts, if you look at the sweep of human history. So I don't think that the clock is going to be turned back. I am concerned, though, about the potential for individuals who have certain ideas to translate those into destructive impact because of the empowerment of the individual, both creatively and destructively. I'm also concerned about fundamentalist humanism, people that feel that humans should not be enhanced. Not 8th century, but take our current state. I think it's actually not a new idea. We've been enhancing humanity for a long time. As I mentioned, life expectancy was 25,000 years ago, 200 years ago. So it's unnatural to take antibiotics. Why not? That's a natural course of things. You get a bacterial infection. Why intervene in an unnatural way? Well, but there is this idea that we should not go beyond, quote, normal human ability. But what's normal? I mean, look at the range of, quote, normal human ability in music or science or anything else. It's a vast range. And I think really going beyond our limitations, enhancing ourselves, is really the story of humanity. That's what we do uniquely, and we should continue that. We see the same thing in terms of not changing biology at all, that we shouldn't enhance biology. But we have to be mindful of dangers and downsides, and we have to test things to make sure they're safe. But going beyond the natural abilities of biology, whether it's in a tomato or a human, I think it's something that we do well. And biology is not perfect. It's very intricate. It's very clever. But as we actually learn how it works, we find that it's very suboptimal. There's a design, for example, for robotic red blood cells by Rob Freitas. Analysis of those indicates if you replace 10% of your red blood cells with these robotic respirosites, you could do an Olympic sprint for 15 minutes without taking a breath, or sit at the bottom of your pool for 4 hours. But aside from those interesting things, it actually would be dramatically beneficial for your health, would keep you going if your heart stopped, would better oxygenate your tissues. We can actually do a good job of extending human biology and biology in general as we learn its secrets, reverse engineer it, simulate it, and then extend it by merging it with our technology.
What companies are at the forefront of your future as you see it? What companies should we be looking to as far as current experimentation going on?
Well, I think an interesting phenomena is that individuals or very small teams can do quite revolutionary work. We do a certain amount of mentoring and early stage investing, and I'm very impressed with the very exciting technology that comes from little teams, and there's just thousands of these entrepreneurs, and they're not just in Silicon Valley and Massachusetts, and they're cropping up in the middle of the United States, in South America, in Africa, Asia. I mean, the internet now is everywhere, and the tools for creation are everywhere, and very creative people are making contributions.
For example?
well, just, I mean, a company that I recently got involved in has created some molecules that actually control gene expression, because we're actually learning that short RNA strands and other molecules control whether genes are expressed or not expressed, whether they're enhanced or suppressed. And so you can take these molecules and actually turn genes off or turn genes on. They have one product that turns on the genes that create some super antioxidants, superoxide demutase and catalase, which are anti-aging molecules. So, I mean, there's a lot of interesting ways of reprogramming biology that are emerging from a lot of little companies. Microsoft and Google are very creative companies. They actually believe in fostering this kind of innovation from inside their companies. And Google has a well-publicized model of having actually all their people spend a fraction of their time just inventing on their own, so that ideas can bubble up. And Microsoft has a different approach to it, but it similarly has a way of creating ideas from the sort of ferment of many individuals who really have a period now where the individual is empowered with the tools to create very revolutionary ideas. And Google is a good example. I mean, it was two kids, students at Stanford, and they created a revolution in search engines. And the opportunity to do that is, even in search engines, is becoming more and more possible.
Do you think that as we look to the future, Microsoft and Google will still be at the forefront of what you see?
Yeah, well, I think those companies will be successful 10 to 15 years from now. It's very hard to predict individual companies. I mean, I can give you predictions about the course of computation and communication. If you ask me the cost of a MIPS of computing in 2014, I can give you a figure and it's likely to be accurate. I can just give you an educated guess when it comes to an individual company. But I know Microsoft and Google quite well, and the key competitive advantage they have is they have a very good way of attracting really creative and brilliant people. And ultimately that's, it's not some lock on the market or some monopoly on something or some very clever technology. All of that will be worthless, in a fairly short period of time. It's really the ability of the people there to keep reinventing and be creative. And those two companies have shown the ability to reinvent themselves. Well, Google hasn't had to reinvent itself yet, but although they've come up with some very creative new things beyond search. And of course, Microsoft has reinvented itself already several times and is working on doing that again. So I have a lot of confidence in those two companies.
For Ray Kurzweil, Dayton, Ohio.
Of computer and aviation. I have gifted hundreds of your books, really 5 books, to friends and customers, and love the book TV. I'm 58, a technologist. My name is Suhas, and I'm founder and CEO of a software company and jet engine component business. Anyway, I have followed your regime of nutrients from Fantastic Voyage for last 10 months and have seen tangible, great results, like high energy, creative, crisp use of mind, and also my sweetheart is thrilled. However, I had followed Dr. Linus Pauling's regime several decades ago on vitamin C and found that it did not give me such pleasant results in the past. My question to you, sir, is that do you have any concern or sense of potentially adverse impact of your daily regime? And also, do you have broader base, good sample number of your regime followers, and what is their consensus? Incidentally, I consider you a great gift to human race.
Well, thanks for your comments. My program, the program that Dr. Grossman and I devised, is not one size fits all, and it's not, okay, do these 5 things and just follow it, and everybody should do the same thing, and that's it. The most important part of the program is actually, to quote the Bible, know thyself and learn about your own body. Take a lot of tests. We describe that in the book to find out, how's your atherosclerosis going, how's your insulin resistance, how's your detoxification system. There's many different ways to measure this. Do you have early detectable forms of cancer? And that's a fair amount of effort, but it really is worthwhile to know your own health situation. Many people, when they do this, discover they have some chronic conditions. Maybe they have metabolic syndrome. A third of the adult population has that as kind of precursor to type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, that really speeds up aging and can lead to full-blown diabetes and so on. So I can't describe all the issues, but it's important to really test yourself. And then as you adopt, you find out, well, maybe you're insulin resistant, so you take some supplements for that. You don't just adopt it and that's the end. You keep testing yourself, seeing if it actually works. See if there are adverse reactions, because sometimes people have reactions to certain supplements. So it's really a period of exploration. We give a lot of ideas in the book. Originally, the publisher said, well, where's the sort of one-trick pony here? But then they actually got on our bandwagon and appreciated the fact that we give a lot of ideas, because our bodies are complex. We don't have some system yet that can just do it all for you. You have to learn about yourself and adopt a personalized program and keep tracking your own health. But if you do that, and armed with the kind of knowledge we provide in Fantastic Voyage, you really can dramatically slow down disease and aging processes, so that even people, I think you said you were 58, I'm 58, we baby boomers can in 10, 15 years, when we have the full flowering of this biotechnology revolution, where we'll have very powerful tools to reprogram biology, can still be in good shape. So I'm delighted to hear that you've had a good experience, and keep it up, keep testing yourself, keep assessing how are you reacting. I spend a lot of my time keeping abreast of new health information about new therapies or new research about old therapies, or even information about my own body that I didn't realize before. It's a constant period of exploration and refinement.
Will pharmacy companies move from creating medicine to creating nanobots, if that's the way that you see as far as the human body being re-engineered?
Well, one trend that we will see is personalized medicine. We're learning, for example, cancer is very personalized. And this idea of just, okay, you get this kind of cancer, you take these chemotherapy drugs, is not a good approach. And we actually find that certain chemotherapy drugs work very well for certain people and not for other people, and we need to figure that out before we give the treatment, or actually create a treatment that's actually designed and works just for the antigens on your cancer cells. And those kinds of therapies are coming. And in fact, we're going to have to redesign FDA approval mechanisms, because they're not well designed for this kind of personalized medicine. But that's actually a very powerful development. But yes, I mean, there's already lots of medical devices and systems where we put computerized devices in your body. You can swallow a tiny little pill that actually takes all kinds of measurements and photographs as it goes through your digestive system, and Bluetooths that information to a little computer you carry in your belt, and then disintegrates. And I mean, I can give you 20 other examples of where we have already, maybe not yet blood cell sized devices, but tiny devices that are computerized and programmable. This implant, this computer you can put inside your brain to replace the biological neurons destroyed by Parkinson's disease, is programmable. You can download new software to the computer in your brain from outside the patient. So there's many exciting examples already. And as these devices get smaller, as I said, we're shrinking them by a factor of 100 per decade in 3D volume, and more powerful, multiplying their power by 1,000 every decade. That's going to become more and more ubiquitous.
We have an emailer who's asking from some career advice. He's an aircraft pilot, and he read your book, and he said that, until reading your book, I assumed that I was in a good career, but I'm not so sure now. Am I in a dead-end job? Will our aircraft fly themselves? Can you discuss some of the impacts of the singularity on transportation?
I think the way to approach careers is to not worry that much about whether particular types of jobs are going to become obsolete, but be open to learning and keeping abreast of the world and following your passion. And if you're passionate about flying, I think by all means do it. I think the world will be a different place, and most jobs that exist today will at least be significantly transformed in the years ahead. So this model where you go to school and then you learn a trade, and that's your ticket to employment and productivity for the rest of your life until you retire, I mean, that model already doesn't exist by and large. People really have to change what they're doing, and I think people should have the attitude to keep learning and to follow your passion, because it's not you don't have to be, even though we're talking about a technological future, you don't have to be a technologist or an engineer to thrive, because it's really knowledge and information that'll have value. But that includes music and art. And I mean, look at how artists have been empowered. I mean, artists used to, you know, have a difficult time making a living unless they were very well known. But now there's this explosion of need for art and graphics on the web, and artists are doing very well, particularly if they have computer skills. And same thing for musicians. And so any kind of knowledge, if you have a passion for it, that's what you should pursue. And keep abreast of how different professions change. I think ultimately transportation will become more automated. You know, certainly if you go out 15, 20 years, flying devices will be, in fact, personalized using nanotechnology, and they'll fly themselves. But
flying devices, cars, or something along that line, as we know it?
Yeah, I think in 20 years we'll have nanotechnology-based flying devices.
Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Hi. As more biological components are replaced by technological ones, and the rift between humanity and technology becomes more narrow, what do you think the possible effects will be on the human psyche, especially the way in which we define humanity and differentiate between it and technology?
Well, I think it's going to change, and you can see already, you know, movements like body modification, tattoos and piercings and so on, which go back, I don't know, 15 years. That was a pretty fringe phenomenon. It's now very mainstream, and people walk around with devices on their eyeglasses and in their ears. And even 5 years ago, if you had a little microphone in your ear with an antenna, that would seem pretty weird. Now we routinely accept that. So conventions actually change pretty quickly, particularly when technologies become viable, and we adjust quite rapidly. I mean, look at how rapidly we've become wired and online. You walk around a college campus and everybody is online with their computers and their things in their hands and in their ears, and they're in some virtual environment while they're walking across campus. And that didn't look like that even 5 years ago. So as these technologies become perfected, I think we accept them more and more. And I think we will accept the idea of enhancing human ability with our technology, because it's a slippery slope from just correcting problems that occur from disease or disability to actually being able to go beyond, quote, normal. And one reason it's a slippery slope is there's no such thing as normal. Human beings have a broad range of abilities. But really, it's the thrust of technology in general. It's why we started creating tools, was to extend our reach. And we started out with the Industrial Revolution extending our physical reach, and we've already, you know, have a half century of extending our mental reach. And our ability to do that is going to become more and more powerful as these tools become more intelligent.
Lansing, Michigan.
Afternoon. It's a pleasure to talk to you, sir. I do a one-man show about Thomas Jefferson that I take to schools, and in my research, I came across a quote that our third president supports you, and I wondered if I could indulge you for a second to read that to you.
Sure, be interested.
The quote goes like this: "I am not an advocate for frequent changes in laws and constitutions, but laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As they become more developed, more enlightened, and as new discoveries are made, new truths discovered, and manners and opinions change, with a change of circumstance, institutions must advance also to keep pace with the time." Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for that. I think I will actually use that in a future book. And actually, if we can get your name, I'll cite you in a footnote. That's a very modern quote that could have been said today. And it's interesting that the pace of change and technical progress was noticed back then. Most people did not notice it. I mean, 200 years ago, people's grandparents, by and large, lived the same lives they did, and they expected their grandchildren to do the same. It was perhaps 200 years ago that we just started, or at least thoughtful, prescient people like Thomas Jefferson noticed that things were changing and that there was such a thing as progress. Because you go back hundreds of years, the idea of progress, people never heard of it. They just thought things stayed the same. There was progress, but it was at such a slow pace that it was not noticeable. Now you'd have to be, pretty asleep not to notice the rapid pace of change. But that's a very up-to-date quote. I appreciate it.
Is there any form of a modern-day Luddite still in the world?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's very strong Luddite movements. Take the anti-GMO movement, genetically modified organism. Now, I'm not saying that GMOs are inherently safe. I think they need to be tested like any other new food or invention that affects our biosphere. But there's been just a reflexive anti-GMO movement that if something is genetically modified, it's absolutely wrong, which I think is just an inherently anti-technology stance. Golden rice, it's now been approved, but it was held up for 5 or 6 years. It could have saved hundreds of thousands of kids from going blind in Africa because of a genetic modification that would provide the right vitamins for these kids in their foods to stave off this type of blindness. African countries have been lobbied not to accept certain grains, certain seeds that would overcome the natural blights that wipe out their livelihood. That's changing now, but that was an example of, I think, a reflexive anti-technology movement. And there is a strong anti-technology movement. Bill McKibben, who I respect, who's actually brought global warming to our attention, wrote a book called Enough, where he says we have enough technology, at least enough advanced technology. Now, his position's actually more sophisticated. He says certain types of advancements we should continue, and it's a complex discussion as to exactly what we should do and what we shouldn't do. But it's an example of an opposition to a certain type of advancement, that we shouldn't, for example, radically extend human longevity, which I think we've been in the process of doing for 1,000 years, but now we're getting to a point where we can do it much more rapidly. But there's definitely strong anti-technology movements, particularly in some academic circles.
Los Angeles, California.
Hi, I'd just like to say that I'm extremely impressed and have not had much exposure to you aside from your phenomenal keyboards and music programs. I'm actually a nutritionist myself and also am extremely impressed with your knowledge of my field. And I actually have a question more about the implications of nanos in the human brain and the basically tendency of governments, especially democracies, to lean towards and eventually turn into what becomes almost a monarchy, and the likelihood of nanos being used to control the populace, and how we would avoid that in the future.
Well, when we have software running in our bodies and brains, all kinds of issues that we now actually struggle with already, even though most of the computers are not yet inside our bodies and brains, will become even more important. Privacy. Well, we already do very private things in our computers, and we realize that people can easily put a spy program on our computer and report back to somebody we don't know everything they were doing. So this is already a concern. Software viruses and other type of malware is an issue, given all the important things we do on our personal computers. But when those computers are inside our bodies and brains, that's going to be more of an issue. We're concerned about security and privacy of health data. Well, if we've got all these computers with that health data inside our bodies and brains and people hack into it, put spyware there, that's going to be a big concern. And potentially people could send software viruses into the nanobots inside our brain and actually influence our thoughts. I mean, that potential is there. That's one of the downsides of these technologies. Software security, therefore, becomes more and more important an issue. Technical issues like encryption, which get very technical, but are actually pretty fundamental, I think, to the future of humanity. Being able to maintain privacy is very important. And actually, a lot of advances being made in encryption. Encryption actually tends to stay ahead of the decryption technology, to the dismay of intelligence agencies, but to the delight of privacy, people who are concerned about privacy. So yes, this will be an issue. I think overall, we get a lot more benefit from our personal computers and the internet today than we are harmed by this kind of malware and software viruses. And we actually have a pretty good system for protecting ourselves from software viruses that we've invested in. New software virus is discovered, and it's reverse engineered, and a protection is created and distributed virally to the internet, generally within 24 hours. So we've done a pretty good job of actually defending ourselves from software viruses. We actually should learn from that as to how we should deal with biological viruses. But this is a whole area that actually will get more and more concerned as the technology gets more and more intimate, and it's already pretty intimate.
As far as the advances are concerned, is it the United States that's leading those advances, or are there other countries involved?
I think we're already very close to a worldwide system, a worldwide economy. You buy a product and might have software done in Silicon Valley, and certain mathematical problems were solved in India, and it was constructed in China, and with just-in-time inventory systems designed in New York. I mean, typical products which have sophisticated software and hardware are already quite complex and involve people all over the world. And most products are intellectual, and that the intellectual part of products, like product designs, can just circulate the globe in seconds on the internet. And this has actually empowered China and India to become successful. But I don't see, it's not a global race as if there's a fixed size pie, and if China and India get more, we're going to get a smaller slice. It's really a positive-sum game. That Chinese engineer is creating value for his or her company, but also for us, because we all benefit from all of these products. And this is actually leading, in my opinion, to the economic growth we see. The information, you might expect that the information technology sector would shrink because of this 50% deflation factor, and some economists actually are worried about that, that if you can get the same stuff for half the money a year later, that the size of the economy, as it has to do with information, would shrink. But we actually see that the opposite is the case. We more than double our consumption. When price performance reaches certain levels, whole new applications explode on the landscape. And we have had 18% growth in information technology in every area in constant dollars for the last 50 years, despite the fact that we have a 50% deflation rate. And in fact, that is what is driving economic growth. As more and more of the economy is comprised of this information technology, which is growing 18% a year, and less of it is comprised of these non-information industries, which are shrinking, the growth rates are increasing. And we see that with these fantastic growth rates in China and India, and even sub-Saharan Africa, because of technology, had a 5% growth rate last year.
About 8 more minutes with our guest, Miami, Florida.
Hi, am I on?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Ray. I have to say that I'm a great fan of yours. But that being said, I have a question about one time you talked about your utopian future, that the future would not be utopian despite the fact of a growth of technology. And I'd like you to explain that for me, please.
Well, I alluded earlier to technology being a double-edged sword. So take biotechnology. I mean, that's, I think, actually a great revolution that's happening now. That we're going from a pre-information era where we just happen to find something and we don't really know why it works, to where we can actually reprogram biology as an information technology. And that's a grand transformation. But it has positive and negative consequences. The positive is that I believe we will be able to reprogram biology away from cancer and heart disease and these other diseases that kill us. 15, 20 years from now, I think we will really overcome these diseases, at least make them manageable chronic conditions, if not eliminate them altogether, through the power of biotechnology. But the downside is it also empowers a bioterrorist to reprogram a biological virus, to make it more deadly or stealthy or communicable. And that's an existential specter that we face right now, and we really need to be doing more about it. But these technologies can be used for creativity or destruction. I think the problems that we've been focused on, that humanity has struggled with for eons, we will ultimately, over the next several decades, get the tools to overcome those problems. But we will still be struggling then with new problems that these technologies introduce.
Will the companies that develop them themselves be able to give proper oversight?
Well, I mean, we have a regulatory system. I think it needs to be reformed in many ways, both to protect ourselves more from these types of dangers on the one hand, and on the other hand, accelerate the approval of life-saving protocols and medications that take too long to be developed. And this is actually an issue in defending ourselves against the dangers, because I mentioned how well we're doing with software viruses, that we can, in one day, capture a virus, a software virus, reverse engineer it, create an antidote, and spread it virally around the internet. And that system actually works extremely well, not perfect, but one of the reasons we can't do that in biology is because of this regulatory system we have. You can't create something, let's say an RNAi medication, and put it out in a day. I mean, a typical approval time is measured in years, not days. And this is actually a concern with bioterrorism. How do you test these things altogether when nobody has these diseases? And it'd be unethical to actually test them, because you can't give people these diseases in order to test them. So we need to do some more creative thinking. I've written about how to approach this problem. But yes, I mean, regulation is going to be very important. We're going to have to reform it in light of these new opportunities and dangers.
Kingsport, Tennessee. Go ahead, please, John, with Ray Kurzweil.
Yes, you are giving a demonstration, Mr. Kurzweil, concerning the handheld scanner to convert print to speech. Does that work on most print fonts? Where can we get more information, and what's its approximate cost?
Yes, we just introduced the Kurzweil National Federation of the Blind Reader in July. It's on the order of 1,000 blind guys and gals going around reading everything from the labels in their clothing to signs on the wall, the back of cereal boxes and menus and handouts at meetings and so on. The product costs $3,500. It does read all common fonts. It won't work on handwriting yet, but it works on all fonts, different sizes. It's really quite flexible. If there's print in its field of view, it generally does a good job reading it. And you can get information at knfbreader.com. knfbreader.com.
We have about 2 minutes left, but this final email: should we fear computers and machines as they begin to equal us in intelligence?
Well, we do fear other humans, right? And you know, we have one human civilization, but it's not been free from conflict. And we had 180 million people die in wars in the 20th century. Maybe as we reverse engineer the human brain, we'll have more insight as to the sources of human conflict, but I'm not predicting that is going to lead us to eliminate human conflict. And I think it's still going to be one integrated human civilization, even more integrated because of this pervasive internet that we have, and that's going to grow in power. But we're not going to eliminate human conflict. In fact, we're empowering individuals to be more destructive with the same technology that we're empowering individuals to be creative. So I would fear the aspects of humanity that we don't understand, that allow us to be destructive and deploy technologies in ways that are inimical to, I think, our better values. I'm hopeful we can do a better job in the 21st century than we did in the 20th century. My own feeling is we will, but that's the optimist in me talking. But we fear human hatred, and that unfortunately is also amplified by these technologies. And hopefully we can take that into account. I've written a lot about how we might do that, but that is something to be feared.
Do you have a new book that you're working on?
Well, my next book is tentatively titled How the Human Brain Works and How to Build One. But that's a number of years off. I've got a number of other irons in the fire before I get to that. But I'm doing now what I do in the early stages, which is gathering information. So as I see interesting articles and books that pertain to this topic, I'm gathering them and